The ground was already waiting, long before the first engines started and the first orders were passed down the chain of command. The earth around Kursk had been torn open and prepared for what was coming. Trenches ran in layers, minefields stretched farther than the eye could see. Artillery positions were dug in deep and calibrated with patience. This was not a battlefield discovered in motion. It was a battlefield constructed in advance, and into it moved Model's Ninth Army. By the summer of 1943, the war in the East had changed character. The lightning campaigns of earlier years were gone. The Red Army had learned how to absorb shock, how to trade space for time, and how to prepare depth instead of relying on collapse. Kursk was not an opportunity created by surprise. It was a deliberate test of strength. The Ninth Army was chosen to break it. Commanded by Walter Model, a general known not for brilliance or audacity, but for discipline and realism, the Ninth Army represented the hard edge of German ground power. It was heavily reinforced, methodically organized, and tasked with advancing directly into the most heavily defended sector of the entire front. There would be no sweeping encirclements here, no open flanks to exploit, no rapid collapse to chase. Every meter would have to be taken under fire. When the attack began, it moved forward into resistance that did not recoil. It hardened. Minefields tore open leading vehicles. Engineers were forced to clear lanes under artillery fire. Tanks advanced in narrow corridors, exposed to anti-tank guns hidden in depth rather than massed in front. Momentum slowed almost immediately. The Ninth Army fought forward not in sweeping thrusts, but in increments measured by loss. Positions were taken, then contested, then counterattacked. The battlefield became a machine of friction, grinding down strength faster than it could be replaced. Model understood what was happening. He pressed cautiously, reinforcing success where it appeared and limiting exposure where resistance proved immovable. But caution could not solve the central problem. The deeper the Ninth Army advanced, the denser the defenses became. Each belt cleared revealed another waiting behind it. The Red Army did not rush to counterattack. It waited. Reserves were held back deliberately. Armor remained concealed. Artillery remained silent until targets were fully committed. The defense was not meant to stop the attack instantly. It was meant to exhaust it first. And it worked. Fuel burned faster than planned. Vehicles were lost faster than replaced. Experienced crews vanished into the soil of the salient. What had begun as an offensive turned into a contest of endurance. One the Ninth Army was never designed to win. German doctrine still sought decision through breakthrough. Kursk offered none. When Soviet counteroffensives finally erupted, they did not strike chaos. They struck depletion. The Ninth Army found itself forced onto the defensive without having achieved its objective, its strength spent inside the depth it was meant to break. The initiative shifted permanently. Model's Ninth Army did not collapse. It withdrew in order. It fought skillfully and with discipline. But the moment at Kursk marked the end of German strategic offense in the East. From here on, operations would be about containment, delay, and survival. The history of the Ninth Army at Kursk is not a story of failure through incompetence. It is a story of realism meeting inevitability, of discipline confronting scale, of an army doing everything right, too late. Kursk proved that the war had passed a point where precision and courage could overcome preparation and mass. It showed that the Eastern Front no longer rewarded penetration, only endurance. This was the battle where attack lost its meaning. Before we go further, pause for a moment and notice where you are. What kind of place is holding you right now? A quiet room, a moving train, a late shift, an early morning? And what time is it there, really? Not on the clock. But in the day you're living, Kursk was fought in hours that stretched into weeks. Let this one unfold at its own pace. This is the story of Model's Ninth Army at Kursk, where movement was swallowed by depth and the future of the war shifted beneath the ground itself. March 15th, 1943. Soviet reconnaissance pilot Lieutenant Anatoly Grigoriev banks his P-2 dive bomber low over the Oral salient, his breath fogging in the -10-degree cockpit as he peers through the cracked plexiglass at the forest below. What he sees makes him pull back on the stick involuntarily, gaining altitude, thinking his eyes are deceiving him. Spread across the snow-covered landscape north of the OK River, geometric patterns emerge. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of vehicles arranged in precise rectangular formations. Tanks, trucks, the half-tracks, artillery pieces, all clustered in assembly areas that stretch for kilometers. He circles once more, his navigator frantically sketching the positions on a map board, counting, estimating, calculating. When they land 2 hours later at the airfield near Kursk, Grigoriev's hands are still shaking as he delivers his report. An entire German army is massing for an attack, and it's the largest concentration of armor he's ever seen. But what Grigoriev couldn't see from 3,000 meters, what no reconnaissance photograph or intercepted radio signal could fully reveal, was the paradox taking shape in those muddy assembly areas. While he counted tanks preparing for offense, German soldiers were digging defensive trenches behind those same attack positions. While Soviet intelligence analysts calculated the striking power of this armored fist, its commander was personally inspecting fallback positions and reserve lines. The formation Grigoriev had photographed wasn't just an army preparing to attack. It was an army preparing to survive. This was the Ninth Army, and it was about to become the most visible and most misunderstood German formation on the entire Eastern Front. Its commander, General Feldmarschall Walter Model, was building something unprecedented, an offensive force with a defensive soul, a striking weapon designed from the beginning to retreat. And in the summer of 1943, this contradiction would define one of the war's most catastrophic battles. The numbers told one story. By early April, the Ninth Army comprised 23 divisions, 6 Panzer, 1 Panzer Grenadier, and 16 infantry formations, packed into assembly areas north of the city of Orel, 335,000 men, 590 tanks and assault guns, 424 self-propelled guns, over 1,000 artillery pieces. On paper, it represented 46% of all German armor committed to Operation Citadel, the summer offensive designed to pinch off the Kursk salient and restore German momentum on the Eastern Front. The attack frontage measured just 50 kilometers, from the town of Trosna northward to the villages above Maloarskhangelsk. This meant the Ninth Army would attack with a density of armor unprecedented in the war, nearly 12 tanks per kilometer of front. For comparison, the German invasion of France in 1940 had deployed roughly 3 tanks per kilometer. The concentration suggested overwhelming force, unstoppable momentum, blitzkrieg at its most refined and lethal. Yet, even as these offensive preparations proceeded, Model was implementing something his superiors at Army Group Center found baffling and his subordinates found exhausting. Behind the attack sectors, German engineers were constructing 3 complete defensive lines. Not hasty fieldworks or token trenches, but proper defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery zones, and prepared demolition sites on every bridge and crossroads. A German infantryman from the 292nd Infantry Division wrote home in late April, "We dig during the day, we dig at night." The General Feldmarschall says, "We build 2 positions, one to fight from, one to die in." I think he plans for us to need both. Model himself appeared at forward positions with startling frequency for an army commander, notebook in hand, personally questioning company commanders about their defensive preparations. Where were the alternate positions? Had they identified withdrawal routes? Were reserve ammunition stocks positioned for defense, not just attack? His staff officers learned to dread these inspections. Model's standards were absolute, his memory for detail unforgiving, and his rage when preparations fell short was legendary. The contradiction intensified as the weeks passed. On April 12th, the Lucy spy ring, a Soviet intelligence network that had penetrated the highest levels of German command, transmitted to Moscow a remarkably precise assessment. Ninth Army, 335,000 men, 590 tanks, 424 assault guns. The numbers matched German planning documents almost exactly. Soviet intelligence now knew not just that an attack was coming, but exactly what forces would deliver it and precisely where they would strike. Yet that same day, aerial reconnaissance photographed Model's engineers fortifying positions 40 kilometers behind the planned start line, camouflaged anti-tank gun emplacements, trench systems designed for all-around defense, supply dumps positioned not for advancing forces but for units falling back under pressure. The Soviets were witnessing something unprecedented, an army preparing simultaneously for its greatest offensive and its inevitable retreat. Model's peculiar approach to warfare had roots in brutal experience. Unlike many German generals who'd spent the war racing across open terrain in triumphant advances, Model had learned his trade in the grinding defensive battles of the previous 2 winters. At Rzhev, in the winter of 1941 and 1942, his Ninth Army had been surrounded, cut off, left to die by a Soviet offensive that shattered the German lines on either side of his position. Hitler had forbidden retreat. Most German commanders would have followed those orders into annihilation. All Model had survived by creating what his staff called hedgehog defenses, circular positions that could defend against attack from any direction, supplied by airlift, sustained by fanatical determination and ruthless tactical flexibility. He'd held the Rzhev salient for months against overwhelming odds, making the Soviets pay in blood for every meter of frozen ground. The experience had marked him. Where other commanders saw offense and defense as separate modes of warfare, Model saw them as inseparable phases of the same continuous struggle. This shaped everything about the Ninth Army's preparation. While other formations committed to Operation Citadel focused purely on the initial breakthrough, Model insisted his units train for defensive operations, even as they rehearsed their attack. Tank companies practiced both assault techniques and rearguard actions. Artillery battalions established both offensive firing positions and pre-registered defensive zones. Infantry battalions dug both jump-off trenches for the attack and fallback positions for when, not if, the advance stalled. His corps commanders found this approach maddening. General Joachim Lemelsen, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, argued repeatedly that the defensive preparations were sapping offensive spirit, creating an expectation of failure before the battle even began. Model's response was characteristic. The Russians don't stop when you want them to. Hope for success. Prepare for catastrophe. The tension between Model's defensive realism and the offensive optimism demanded by Hitler's headquarters would define the coming battle. By late April, Model's force structure revealed the depth of his preparations. He'd organized his 23 divisions into 3 corps, the 47th Panzer Corps on the left, the 41st Panzer Corps in the center, and the 23rd Corps on the right. But unlike typical German offensive deployments, he maintained 6 full divisions in reserve, an unprecedented proportion for an attacking force. These reserves weren't positioned near the attack front to exploit success. They were dispersed in depth, placed to block potential Soviet counterattacks, or cover a withdrawal if necessary. The elite 20th Panzer Division, one of the Army's most powerful formations, sat 40 kilometers behind the start line. The 4th Panzer Division occupied positions even further back. To offensive-minded generals at Army Group Center, and this looked like defeatism. To Model, it looked like survival. He'd studied the intelligence estimates of Soviet defensive preparations around Kursk and concluded what few other German commanders were willing to admit. The attack would fail, and when it did, the Soviets would counterattack with everything they had. The soldiers of the Ninth Army absorbed these contradictions in ways their commanders couldn't articulate. They saw the mountains of ammunition being stockpiled, the fuel dumps being established, the replacement tanks arriving daily, all signs of an offensive of unprecedented scale. Yet they also dug trenches that pointed backward, established supply dumps along retreat routes, and received orders to memorize the locations of demolition, points on bridges they expected to cross in triumph. Some found the preparation reassuring, and evidence that their commander actually cared whether they survived. Others found it psychologically corrosive, an admission of defeat before the first shot was fired. What none of them yet realized was that Model's paradoxical preparations, offensive power combined with defensive realism, would be the only reason most of them would live through the summer. The Ninth Army was becoming a phantom, visible to Soviet reconnaissance, but fundamentally misunderstood by friend and enemy alike. It looked like a weapon of conquest. It was actually an instrument of survival. As spring turned to summer, the weight of knowledge settled over both sides of the front. Soviet intelligence possessed details about the coming German offensive that bordered on the absurd, exact unit designations, attack objectives, even the planned H-hour for the assault. And yet they struggled to understand Model's defensive preparations behind the attack sectors. Was this elaborate deception, a lack of confidence, or something more subtle? A commander who understood that, in modern warfare, the boundary between offense and defense had collapsed entirely, that any attack powerful enough to matter would inevitably generate counterattacks that made defensive preparation essential. The Soviets built their own fortifications in response, creating defensive zones of unprecedented depth and complexity. They laid hundreds of thousands of mines. They dug thousands of kilometers of trenches. They registered every square meter of likely German approach routes with artillery. Two armies were preparing for collision, each knowing almost everything about the other's plans. They each convinced they understood what the other was thinking. Both were partially right. Both were catastrophically wrong about what would actually matter when the battle began. January 23, 1942. General Walter Model stands in the command bunker at Sikivka, deep in the Rzhev salient, studying a map that shows his 9th Army surrounded on 3 sides. The situation is simple and catastrophic. Soviet forces have broken through to the north and south, cutting the supply lines that connect his 200,000 men to the rest of Army Group Center. The temperature outside is minus 35 degrees Celsius. Ammunition stocks will last perhaps 4 days. Food, maybe a week. Hitler's orders are explicit. Hold the position, no retreat under any circumstances. Model's chief of staff stands beside him, and waiting for the explosion of rage that usually follows impossible orders. Instead, Model picks up a red pencil and begins drawing circles on the map, not retreat routes, but defensive perimeters. "We don't need a road to Berlin," he says quietly. "We need landing strips for the Luftwaffe and killing zones for the Russians. We're not leaving. We're making them regret they came." Over the next 4 months, the Rzhev Hedgehog will become a legend of defensive warfare, supplied entirely by air, holding against repeated Soviet offensives that turn the frozen forest into an abattoir. Model will emerge with a reputation as Hitler's miracle worker, the general who refuses to lose. But those who serve under him will remember something different: the absolute unyielding insistence that survival requires preparation for the worst. And it's this experience at Rzhev, not the triumph of France in 1940 or the initial victories of Barbarossa, shaped everything Model would become. While other German generals retained the offensive mindset of the war's early years, Model had learned warfare's brutal mathematics on the Eastern Front. He'd learned that Soviet armies didn't collapse when encircled, they fought harder. He'd learned that initial success meant nothing if you couldn't hold what you'd taken. He'd learned that armor without infantry support was helpless, that infantry without reserves was doomed, that logistics mattered more than tactics, and that defensive preparation wasn't cowardice but the only reliable form of tactical insurance. By the time he was given command of the 9th Army permanently in January 1942, Dahl Model had developed what his staff called the fireman's doctrine, a philosophy of warfare built on the assumption that everything that could go wrong would go wrong, and that survival belonged to commanders who prepared for catastrophe as thoroughly as they planned for success. The doctrine manifested in details that seemed paranoid to officers trained in traditional German operational methods. Model demanded that every battalion headquarters establish not 1 but 3 alternate command posts, with communications to all 3 maintained constantly. He insisted that supply dumps be dispersed and camouflaged rather than concentrated for efficiency. He required that every defensive position include pre-surveyed artillery defensive fires, coordinates calculated in advance so that guns could respond to attack within minutes without waiting for forward observers to adjust fire. Most controversially, he demanded that every unit maintain prepared fallback positions, even during offensive operations. This last requirement generated fierce resistance from subordinates who argued it undermined offensive spirit. Model's response, delivered at a Corps Commanders Conference in August 1942, became famous. "The Russians don't stop when you want them to. We will advance when we can. We will defend when we must. And we will retreat when survival requires it. Any officer who cannot accept this should request transfer now." No one requested transfer. But the tension between Model's defensive realism and the offensive culture of the Wehrmacht remained a constant source of friction. Model's relationship with his soldiers was equally contradictory. He drove them mercilessly, appearing without warning at forward positions to demand explanations for any defensive weakness, any unregistered firing lane, any inadequately prepared fallback route. Soldiers who'd served under him told stories of Model conducting personal inspections of battalion positions at 3 a.m, checking whether machine gun positions had adequate fields of fire, whether trench drainage was properly maintained, whether communication wire was buried deep enough to survive artillery bombardment. All officers learned that there was no detail too small for the Generalfeldmarshal's attention, and no excuse adequate for failure to meet his standards. The nickname Frontenschwein, frontline pig, was earned through this relentless personal presence in the combat zone, unusual for an army-level commander. Yet this same demanding presence generated fierce loyalty. Model soldiers knew their commander understood their reality because he spent so much time sharing it. When he ordered defensive preparations, they knew he was trying to keep them alive, not covering his own failure of nerve. By early 1943, as planning for Operation Citadel began, Model's reputation within the Wehrmacht was unique and polarizing. To Hitler, he was the reliable fireman, and the general who could be sent to any crisis on the Eastern Front with confidence he'd find a way to stabilize the situation. The Führer had personally awarded Model the Knight's Cross with oak leaves after Schujev, praising his fanatical will to hold and his creative defensive solutions. This earned Model the nickname Hitler Junge, Hitler's boy general, a designation that suggested special favor, but also special scrutiny. Model understood the paradox of his position. Hitler valued his defensive expertise, but expected offensive success. The Supreme Commander wanted generals who could hold impossible positions, but also execute ambitious attacks. Model had to be both the cautious defender and the aggressive attacker, often simultaneously. As Citadel planning proceeded through the spring, this contradiction would become unsustainable. That the Model's first response to the Citadel plan revealed his fundamental skepticism. In February 1943, he traveled to Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg to receive his orders for the offensive. The briefing laid out an ambitious double envelopment of the Kursk salient. Model's 9th Army would attack from the north, while Field Marshal von Manstein's Army Group South attacked from the south, meeting somewhere in the middle to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the salient. Hitler presented this as the opportunity to regain the initiative in the east, to restore German mobility, to inflict the kind of catastrophic defeat that would force Stalin to negotiate. Model listened to the presentation, studied the maps and force tables, and then asked a single question. My Führer, this will work only if, what comes after the if? Hitler was momentarily confused. Model clarified, it will work if the Russians don't know we're coming. It will work if they haven't prepared defenses. It will work if they don't have reserves to commit. My Führer? What if all those conditions are false? The room fell silent. Model had just questioned not the plan's execution, but its fundamental premise. The meeting at Rastenburg established the pattern for the next 4 months. Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command insisted the offensive proceed. Model demanded delays to allow more preparation, better intelligence, additional reserves. Every postponement, and there would be several between March and July, reinforced Model's conviction that the operation was fundamentally flawed. That Soviet defensive preparations were growing more formidable by the week. New tanks were arriving, but so were reports of new Soviet anti-tank weapons. Most troubling, intelligence indicated that Soviet commanders knew the attack was coming and were preparing accordingly. Model summarized his concerns in a written report in May. The enemy is aware of our intentions. His defensive preparations are extensive and growing. Our attack will achieve tactical surprise in neither time nor place. Success, if achieved, will come at costs that consume our reserves and leave us vulnerable to counteroffensive. The report reached Hitler's desk. It was noted, filed, and ignored. The offensive would proceed. Model's response to this institutional momentum was characteristically practical. If he couldn't stop the offensive, yet he would prepare to survive its failure. Through April and May, even as his forces rehearsed their attack, He intensified defensive preparations behind the lines. He personally test drove a captured Soviet T-34 tank through various terrain around Orel, studying its performance, identifying its vulnerabilities, then ordering changes to German anti-tank gun positioning based on what he'd learned. He required every panzer division to conduct training exercises in which they practiced not just breakthrough tactics, but also rearguard actions and fighting withdrawals. He established a 3-tier system of fallback positions, extending 40 kilometers behind the planned attack axis, the Hagen Line, the Michel Line, and a third unnamed defensive zone that existed only in contingency plans. His corps commanders thought he was preparing for defeat. Old Model saw it as preparing for reality. The tension between offensive requirements and defensive preparations created surreal situations in the 9th Army's assembly areas. Units would spend mornings rehearsing assault tactics, then afternoons digging trenches behind their jump-off positions. Tank crews would practice breakthrough maneuvers, then receive briefings on how to conduct fighting withdrawals while maintaining unit cohesion. Artillery batteries would register offensive firing coordinates, then immediately register defensive fires covering the same ground from the opposite direction. Junior officers found the contradictions bewildering. Senior commanders found them demoralizing. Model found them essential. In one remarkable incident in late May, he visited a panzer battalion conducting training and discovered they'd neglected to establish security positions around their assembly area. Model halted the exercise, assembled the entire battalion, and delivered an hour-long lecture on the history of Soviet surprise attacks. The message was unmistakable. Preparing to attack didn't mean forgetting to defend. By late June, as the final date for Citadel approached, Model had created an army unlike any other in the Wehrmacht. It possessed enormous offensive power, nearly 600 tanks and assault guns, backed by over 1,000 artillery pieces and supported by hundreds of aircraft. But it also possessed defensive depth unprecedented for an attacking force, with prepared fallback positions, dispersed reserves, and detailed contingency plans for withdrawal under pressure. Model's staff had calculated supply requirements, not just for the advance, but for a fighting retreat. They'd identified demolition points on every bridge and prepared charges in advance. They'd established casualty collection points and supply dumps along potential withdrawal routes. An army preparing for one of history's largest offensives had simultaneously prepared for one of its most complex retreats. The soldiers of the 9th Army would advance into battle carrying not just the confidence of attack, but the insurance of prepared defense. Model's fireman's doctrine was about to be tested at a scale he'd never imagined, in a battle that would prove both his genius and the limits of that genius when confronting strategic realities beyond any general's power to change. May 1st, 1943. In a nondescript building at Bletchley Park, England, a junior cryptanalyst named Peter Calvo-Caresi stares at a decoded German signal that's just emerged from the bombs, the electromechanical machines that break Wehrmacht Enigma encryptions. The message is from Field Marshal von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center, to all subordinate formations. It sets preliminary dates for Operation Citadel, May 9th for the Northern Pincer, May 10th for the Southern. Calvo-Caresi, following standard procedure, marks the decrypt ultra and forwards it through the secure channel that feeds intelligence to Allied commanders. Within 36 hours, Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally ensures the information reaches Joseph Stalin through the British liaison in Moscow. The intercept is precise, specific, and operationally priceless. It's also just one of 27 separate intelligence sources that will confirm German intentions at Kursk over the next 2 months. The Soviets are about to receive not intelligence, but certainty. And certainty, as they will discover, creates its own dangerous assumptions. The flow of information to Soviet intelligence throughout the spring of 1943 approached levels that would seem implausible if the documentary record weren't so comprehensive. The Lucy spy ring, a Swiss-based network with sources deep inside German military intelligence, transmitted a steady stream of precise data. Unit designations, equipment counts, attack axes, even proposed timing. British ultra-decrypts provided strategic context and high-level planning decisions. Soviet partisan networks behind German lines photographed assembly areas. Yeats counted vehicles, and noted the arrival of new formations. Soviet aerial reconnaissance flew daily missions over the Oral salient, documenting the German buildup with thousands of photographs. Soviet signals intelligence intercepted and decoded German radio traffic, tracking unit movements and identifying command relationships. The Military Intelligence Directorate of the Red Army, the GRU, compiled all this information into assessments so detailed that Soviet commanders sometimes knew more about German formations than those formations' own officers. June 12, 1943. A Soviet partisan unit designated Sasha, operating in the forests north of Orel, executes what their post-war reports would call their most successful reconnaissance mission of the war. Led by a former Red Army photographer who'd been trapped behind German lines during the retreat of 1942, the team infiltrated to within 2 kilometers of a major German tank park near Karachev. Using a pre-war Leica camera with a telephoto lens stolen from a German officer's quarters, they photographed the complete layout of the assembly area over 3 nights. The images, transmitted via courier to partisan headquarters, then forwarded to Moscow, showed rows of tanks, organized by type and unit. Soviet intelligence analysts could count individual vehicles, identify specific formations, and calculate the precise strength of the armored forces preparing to attack. The photographs matched aerial reconnaissance, which matched signals intelligence, which matched agent reports. Everything confirmed everything else. Yet the Soviets possessed not scattered pieces of a puzzle, but a complete picture. Yet the very completeness of Soviet intelligence created a subtle trap. By late June, Soviet commanders at the Central Front, facing Model's Ninth Army, knew the German attack was coming with such certainty that they began to treat it as an inevitable, almost scripted event. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front, had constructed a 3-dimensional terrain model at his headquarters showing every German unit in Model's attack sector, represented by red flags precisely positioned according to intelligence reports. Officers briefed on defensive plans could walk around this model, studying the coming battle as if it had already been fought. Rokossovsky knew the Germans would attack on a 50-kilometer front from Trosna to Maloarkhangelsk, and he knew they would employ 6 panzer divisions in the first wave. He knew they had roughly 600 tanks and assault guns. He knew their objective was to break through to Kursk within 4 to 6 days. This knowledge shaped Soviet defensive preparations in profound ways. They fortified exactly the sectors intelligence indicated would be attacked. They positioned reserves to counter exactly the German units identified in reports. They registered artillery fires on exactly the assembly areas shown in reconnaissance photographs. The maskirovka, the Soviet art of military deception, took an unusual form at Kursk. Rather than hiding their preparations, the Soviets made them ostentatiously visible. They wanted the Germans to see the fortifications, to understand the depth of the defenses, and to recognize that they were walking into a prepared killing ground. Soviet engineers constructed over 5,000 kilometers of trenches in the Central Front sector alone. They laid over 400,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. They built multiple defensive lines, each bristling with anti-tank strongpoints, machine gun positions, and artillery observation posts. This wasn't concealment. It was deterrence through transparency. Rokossovsky later wrote that he hoped the visible defensive preparations would convince Hitler to cancel the offensive entirely. The calculation was simple. If the Germans knew they faced such formidable defenses, surely they'd recognize the attack couldn't succeed. Hence, this reasoning underestimated Hitler's capacity for wishful thinking and overestimated the Wehrmacht's institutional ability to acknowledge unpleasant truths. By late June, the intelligence picture had reached such precision that it bordered on the surreal. On June 28th, the Lucy Ring transmitted to Moscow the exact H-hour for the German attack, 0430 hours on July 5th. Soviet intelligence now knew not just what was coming, but when, where, and how. British intelligence liaison in Moscow passed a remarkable assessment to Soviet counterparts. The Germans are walking into a minefield with a map. Yet, even this near-perfect foreknowledge had limits. Soviet intelligence had focused intensely on German offensive preparations, but paid less attention to Model's peculiar defensive arrangements behind the attack sectors. The fortifications model was building in depth, the reserve positioning, the prepared withdrawal routes. These were noted but not fully analyzed. Soviet planners assumed these were standard German tactical prudence, not evidence of model's expectation that the offensive would fail. This would prove a crucial misunderstanding in the battle's later phases. The one piece of intelligence the Soviets lacked was psychological. They knew everything about German capabilities, but misunderstood German intentions. Or, more precisely, they misunderstood the Wehrmacht's internal contradictions. Hitler wanted the offensive to proceed, despite mounting evidence it couldn't succeed. Model wanted to delay or cancel it, but prepared to execute it anyway. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding the Southern Panzer, and thought success was possible with proper timing and resources. General Heinz Guderian, the Inspector General of Panzer Forces, thought the whole operation was a catastrophic waste of armor, better saved for defensive operations. These competing views within German high command created decision-making paralysis that delayed the offensive repeatedly, from May to June, from June to early July, giving Soviet defenders more time to prepare, but also creating operational incoherence in the German attack plan. Soviet intelligence could report these delays, but couldn't fully analyze what they revealed about German strategic confusion. The accumulation of intelligence created both advantages and vulnerabilities for Soviet defenders. The advantage was obvious. They could prepare with precision, positioning forces exactly where needed, and building defenses perfectly aligned with German attack axes, planning artillery fires that would devastate German assembly areas. Soviet defensive doctrine had evolved specifically to counter German armored warfare, and now they could implement that doctrine with foreknowledge of where and when the blow would fall. They created anti-tank packets, clusters of 4 to 6 anti-tank guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, each gun sighted to support the others, the entire packet capable of engaging attacking armor from multiple angles simultaneously. They positioned their best units in sectors where German main efforts would strike. They held massive reserves positioned to counterattack German penetrations or exploit German exhaustion. Theoretically, it was the perfect defense. The vulnerability was subtler, but potentially fatal. Perfect intelligence can breed overconfidence, the assumption that knowing what's coming is the same as being able to stop it. Some Soviet commanders, looking at the comprehensive defensive preparations and the detailed intelligence on German forces, began to see the coming battle as a foregone conclusion. A German attack that would shatter itself against prepared defenses, followed by Soviet counteroffensives that would exploit German exhaustion. This overlooked several crucial variables. First, German tactical proficiency remained extremely high. Knowing where an attack will come doesn't negate the reality of experienced soldiers executing well-rehearsed combined arms operations. Second, the Ninth Army alone had 600 tanks and assault guns. Amidst the concentrated firepower of that much armor, even attacking into prepared positions would generate carnage and chaos that no amount of preparation could fully mitigate. Third, and most important, the intelligence that seemed so comprehensive in June would inevitably degrade in the chaos and friction of actual combat. Once the battle began, all those precisely positioned red flags on Rokossovsky's terrain model would start moving in unexpected ways. June 22, 1943, exactly 2 years after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a captured German soldier from the 6th Infantry Division provided his NKVD interrogators with detailed information about new German tank destroyers called Elefant. The soldier had been part of a work detail that helped unload these vehicles from rail cars and described their massive size, their thick armor, their enormous 88mm guns. His description matched aerial reconnaissance photos of unusual vehicles Soviet analysts had been trying to identify. The interrogation report was cross-referenced with other sources, and within days Soviet anti-tank units received specific instructions on engaging these new vehicles. Aim for the tracks and wheels to immobilize them, then attack the thinner side armor. This kind of tactical intelligence, specific, actionable, rapidly disseminated, characterized Soviet intelligence work throughout the Kursk preparations. They weren't just gathering information, they were converting it into operational advantage. Yet, for all this success, its Soviet intelligence faced one problem it couldn't solve: Strategic uncertainty about German intentions after Kursk. What if the offensive succeeded? What if it failed? What were German operational goals beyond the immediate encirclement of the salient? This mattered because it affected how aggressively Soviets should commit their reserves during the defensive battle. Rokossovsky's orders from Stalin were explicit: destroy the German offensive, then prepare for counter-offensive operations. But the timing and scale of those counter-offensives depended on how much of Soviet strength was consumed in the defensive fighting. Soviet planners couldn't know in advance how the battle's mathematics would work, how many casualties they'd suffer, how much armor they'd lose, how deeply Germans would penetrate before being stopped. All the intelligence in the world couldn't answer those questions. Only the battle itself would provide those answers, written in burned-out tanks and shattered divisions. The most predicted surprise attack in history was about to begin, and despite all the foreknowledge, despite all the preparation, both sides retained the capacity to surprise each other in ways that would matter profoundly. Knowing what's coming, as both sides were about to discover, is not the same as controlling what happens next. July 4th, 1943, 2300 hours. In his command bunker, 15 kilometers behind the Ninth Army's forward positions, General Feldmarschall Walter Model studies the latest intelligence report with the expression his staff has learned to dread. A Soviet deserter, a lieutenant from an artillery regiment, has provided detailed coordinates of Soviet gun positions facing the German attack sectors. The information seems credible, corroborated by aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence. But more troubling is what the deserter says about Soviet planning. They know the German attack begins at 0430 tomorrow morning, and they've planned a massive preemptive artillery bombardment to hit German assembly areas at 0300 hours, 90 minutes before the German attack. Model's chief of staff waits for the decision. The Army's artillery is already positioned to deliver its own preliminary bombardment at 0400, 30 minutes before H hour. But if the Soviets strike first at 0300, they'll catch thousands of German infantry in open assembly areas, waiting to move to their jump-off positions. The casualties could be catastrophic. Model makes his decision with characteristic directness. We fire at 0220. Tell every battery commander personally, I want confirmation from each gun position. He's going to preempt the preemption. The order ripples through the Ninth Army's artillery network with barely 2.5 hours to execute. Battery commanders receive phone calls waking them from whatever sleep they had managed. Fire mission data, carefully calculated over preceding weeks, must be modified for the new timeline. Ammunition that was to be expended beginning at 0400 must now be ready 90 minutes earlier, as infantry units in assembly areas must be notified of the change, so they are not caught exposed when their own artillery opens fire. The complexity is enormous, the time available minimal, and the stakes absolute. Failure to execute properly could mean German guns firing on German troops, or defensive fires so poorly coordinated they achieve nothing except warning the Soviets that something is happening. Model has gambled that his artillery system can handle this last-minute modification. He's also gambled that the deserter's information is accurate, and that Soviet artillery is actually planning a 0300 strike. If he's wrong, if the Soviets weren't planning to fire, or if they fire later than reported, then Model will have wasted surprise and possibly disrupted his own attack for nothing. July the 5th, 0220 hours. At 500 German guns open fire simultaneously along the Ninth Army's front. The night sky erupts in orange flashes as high explosive shells arc toward Soviet positions. The sound is overwhelming, a physical pressure wave that hammers the eardrums and shakes the ground. Forward observers with frontline units report that shells are landing on suspected Soviet artillery positions, on command bunkers, on communication centers identified through weeks of intelligence work. The bombardment isn't designed to destroy Soviet defenses. No artillery bombardment in human history has ever destroyed a prepared defensive position, but to disrupt Soviet artillery before it can fire its own bombardment. Model is trading surprise for survival. Announcing the attack hours early in hopes of preventing Soviet guns from devastating his infantry before the attack even begins. It's a calculated gamble, and for the first critical minutes, no one knows if it's working. At 0230, 10 minutes after German guns opened fire, Soviet artillery begins its response. But it's not the coordinated, crushing bombardment Soviet planners had intended. It's ragged, uneven, some batteries firing immediately while others struggle to respond. The German preemption has disrupted Soviet timing, caught some crews in the open, destroyed communication links between forward observers and gun positions. Soviet shells begin falling on German positions, but many land on assembly areas that are now empty. German infantry has moved to jump-off positions earlier than planned, on reacting to their own artillery fire. The Soviet bombardment, planned to last 2 hours and deliver roughly 2,500 tons of high explosive onto German concentrations, achieves perhaps 60% of its intended effect. It's still devastating. German soldiers in forward positions experience a hurricane of steel and fire that tears apart bunkers, flips vehicles, and shreds anyone caught in the open. But it's not the overwhelming deluge that might have crippled the German attack before it began. The cost of Model's preemption becomes apparent as the German attack timeline unfolds. The original plan called for infantry to move to jump-off positions at 0330, followed by a final artillery preparation at 0400, with the assault beginning at 0430. But the earlier artillery fire has disrupted this choreography. Infantry units, displaced by their own and Soviet artillery, are scattered and disorganized. More critically, the panzer divisions, the armored spearheads that are supposed to exploit the infantry breakthrough, have been thrown into chaos by the changed timeline. Tank commanders who'd planned to move to assembly areas at 0400 are now scrambling to move earlier, through darkness, through Soviet artillery fire, along routes clogged with displaced infantry and destroyed vehicles. The 47th Panzer Corps, Model's main armored striking force, reports to Army headquarters at 0415 that its tanks are 30 to 45 minutes behind schedule reaching their start positions. While at precisely 0430, the original H hour, German infantry begins crossing the start line in sectors where units have managed to reorganize despite the earlier disruption. But the attack lacks the sledgehammer coordination German operational art normally achieves. Some units attack on schedule, supported by artillery. Others attack late, without proper artillery support. The panzer divisions, supposed to follow closely behind the infantry breakthrough, are still moving forward through congested approach routes. Model's preemptive strike has saved an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 German infantrymen who would have been caught in open assembly areas by Soviet artillery. But it's cost the attack perhaps 45 minutes of coordination and momentum. In the mathematics of breakthrough operations, where every minute allows defenders to react, to reposition, to call for reinforcements, that 45 minutes will matter enormously. Model himself, standing in his command bunker as reports flow in during those chaotic early hours, appears calm to his staff, but admits privately years later that these were the most uncertain moments of his career. He'd made a decision based on fragmentary intelligence from a single deserter, disrupted his entire army's attack plan with 2 hours' notice, and traded tactical surprise for what he believed was operational survival. The question haunting him as the sun rose on July 5th was simple. Had he made the right choice? His chief of staff, summarizing the night's events in the Army War Diary, wrote a single sentence that captured the ambiguity. "We won the artillery duel, but lost the tank race." The Ninth Army had prevented Soviet artillery from devastating its infantry before the attack, but it had also given Soviet defenders warning and time, and in defensive warfare, time is the ultimate force multiplier. The July 5th bombardment duel established patterns that would define the entire battle. Model's decision to preempt reflected his fundamental pessimism about the offensive's prospects. He was already making decisions designed to minimize casualties rather than maximize breakthrough prospects. This defensive mindset, so unusual for a commander launching an offensive, permeated every subsequent decision he made. When faced with choices between bold advance and careful consolidation, Model consistently chose caution. When offered opportunities to commit reserves for exploitation versus holding them for security, he held them back. His artillery preemption on July 5th wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a statement of philosophy. Model was commanding an offensive he didn't believe could succeed, and his primary goal had shifted from achieving breakthrough to preserving his army for the defensive battles he knew were coming. Soviet commanders, analyzing the German artillery preemption in the hours after it occurred, drew conflicting conclusions. Some saw it as evidence of German desperation, attacking early because they feared Soviet preparedness. Others saw it as proof of German tactical sophistication, the ability to modify complex operations at the last minute based on fresh intelligence. Rokossovsky, the Central Front commander, may noted in his memoir that the preemption demonstrated that the enemy retained high operational flexibility even at the tactical level. But he also noted that it confirmed what Soviet intelligence had been reporting. The Germans were committed to the attack despite overwhelming evidence that it would fail. The German willingness to proceed with Citadel in the face of comprehensive Soviet preparation struck Rokossovsky as almost incomprehensible. He understood organizational momentum and political pressure, but the gap between what German intelligence surely knew about Soviet defenses and the decision to attack anyway suggested a level of strategic desperation that Rokossovsky found both reassuring and disturbing. An enemy that desperate was dangerous in unpredictable ways. The pre-dawn bombardment duel also revealed the limits of intelligence and preparation. Despite all Soviet foreknowledge, despite all their defensive construction, despite their own planned preemptive bombardment, the Germans had still managed to seize initiative in the battle's opening hours. Model's 2-hour notice preemption shouldn't have been possible. The organizational complexity of retiming 500 guns should have made it impossible. That it succeeded said something about German tactical proficiency that worried Soviet commanders even as they welcomed the German attack's disruption. If the Wehrmacht could modify a massive artillery strike with 2 hours' notice, what other tactical surprises might they produce? This question would haunt Soviet planning throughout the battle, and generating a caution that sometimes seemed at odds with the confidence their intelligence should have provided. As dawn broke on July 5, 1943, both armies moved toward collision with fundamentally different mindsets. Soviet defenders were confident their preparations would blunt the German attack, but uncertain how much it would cost them to do so. German attackers were committed to an offensive most senior commanders privately doubted, but were executing with the professionalism that remained the Wehrmacht's defining characteristic, even as strategic circumstances turned against them. Model's preemptive bombardment had achieved its immediate tactical goal. It had prevented a Soviet artillery strike from devastating German infantry before the attack began. But it had also announced the German attack hours early, or given Soviet defenders warning and disrupted the German timetable in ways that would cascade through the coming days. The most predicted surprise attack in history had begun with a surprise of its own. And now the question was whether tactical cleverness could overcome strategic hopelessness. The next 18 hours would provide a harsh answer, written in burning tanks and shattered men across a 6-kilometer strip of devastated ground. July 5th, 1943, 05:15 hours. Panzer Lieutenant Hans Schäufler of the 20th Panzer Division sits in his Panzer IV's turret, watching the first light of dawn reveal the minefield ahead. His company, 14 tanks strong at the start line, has been ordered to lead the breakthrough in this sector, advancing along a north-south road toward the village of Bobbrick. Yes, the early morning fog hasn't lifted yet, reducing visibility to perhaps 200 meters. Through his periscope, Schäufler can see the dark shapes of disabled vehicles from the night's artillery exchanges. A burned half-track, an overturned truck, what might be a destroyed anti-tank gun. The radio crackles. Battalion confirms the attack proceeds. Infantry will follow behind the armor. Schäufler's company commander gives the order. Forward at 8 kilometers per hour. Maintain formation. Watch for anti-tank positions. Schäufler's driver engages the clutch, and the Panzer IV lurches forward. Within 3 minutes, his tank has advanced 200 meters. Then the first mine detonates under the lead tank, ripping off its left track and stopping the entire column. Welcome to the Kursk Cauldron. Next, the opening phase of the Ninth Army's attack revealed immediately what intelligence had warned, but what tactical optimism had dismissed. Soviet defensive preparations were not just formidable, but fundamentally different from anything German forces had previously encountered. The Red Army had learned from 2 years of defeats. Instead of linear defenses designed to hold ground, they had created defensive zones designed to channel, slow, and destroy attacking forces through layered obstacles and interlocking fires. The first obstacle was mine density unprecedented in the war's history. Soviet engineers had laid anti-tank mines not in scattered patterns, but in dense bands. Some areas featured more than 1,500 mines per kilometer of front. These weren't designed to stop the German advance completely, but to slow it, force tanks into predictable routes, create congestion that made German armor vulnerable to artillery and anti-tank fire. Schäufler's company spent the next hour clearing a path through the first minefield, engineers working under fire, tanks providing covering fire against suspected Soviet positions. By 0600 hours, they'd advanced perhaps 500 meters and lost 3 tanks, 1 to a mine, 2 to anti-tank guns firing from concealed positions. The second obstacle was the anti-tank gun density and positioning. Soviet doctrine called for anti-tank packets, clusters of 4 to 6 guns positioned in mutual support, sighted in depth so that if one position was suppressed or destroyed, others could continue engaging. And German tanks advancing through cleared lanes and minefields found themselves under fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The Soviet 76th mm divisional guns, firing from ranges of 400 to 800 meters, couldn't reliably penetrate a Panzer IV's frontal armor, but they could destroy tracks, damage gun mantlets, and kill tanks with side shots. More dangerous were the heavier 85 mm anti-aircraft guns employed in ground roll, capable of penetrating German medium tank armor at range. Soviet anti-tank crews had been trained to hold fire until German tanks were within 600 meters, then engage with rapid fire, not aimed shots at specific tanks, but volume fire into the kill zone. This created a different kind of battle than German tankers expected, and instead of identifying targets and engaging them individually, German tanks were fighting against a defensive system where destroyed positions were immediately replaced by fires from other positions deeper in the defensive zone. By mid-morning, the scale of the challenge became apparent to German corps, commanders reviewing the first reports from attacking units. The 47th Panzer Corps, model's strongest formation, attacking along the main axis toward Olkovatka, reported penetrations of 4 to 6 kilometers, but at costs that suggested the entire offensive was already in trouble. The 20th Panzer Division had lost approximately 30 tanks by 0800 hours, most to mines and anti-tank fire, with only 15 actually destroyed, the rest immobilized or damaged severely enough to require recovery. The 9th Panzer Division, attacking in parallel, reported similar results. Advance of 4 kilometers, 22 tanks lost or disabled. Infantry divisions supporting the armor were taking even heavier casualties. The 292nd Infantry Division reported at 0900 hours that it had reached its first day objectives, but had suffered 800 casualties doing so, a rate that, if sustained, would render the division combat ineffective within 4 days. At 0830, Soviet Sergeant Alexei Chumak and his anti-tank rifle team demonstrated the kind of tactical adaptation that made Soviet defenses so difficult to penetrate. Positioned in a concealed bunker 400 meters south of the road to Bobrik, Chumak's team had allowed the first German tank wave to pass by without firing, and following orders to engage soft-skinned vehicles and infantry, not tanks. As German half-tracks carrying infantry moved forward behind the tanks, Chumak's team opened fire. The 14.5mm PTRD anti-tank rifle couldn't destroy an armored vehicle, but could penetrate a half-track's thin armor easily. In 15 minutes of firing, they destroyed 4 half-tracks and killed or wounded perhaps 30 German infantrymen. Then, before German forces could locate and suppress their position, they retreated through a pre-dug tunnel network that connected their bunker to a secondary position 200 meters to the rear. This kind of defensive mobility, shoot and scoot from prepared positions, frustrated German attempts to suppress Soviet defenses with counter-battery fire or assault tactics. The afternoon of July 5th brought no improvement for German attackers and introduced new complications. As panzer divisions penetrated deeper into Soviet defensive zones, they encountered the second defensive belt, a fresh line of anti-tank positions, minefields, and infantry strongpoints positioned 3 to 5 kilometers behind the first. German operational planning had anticipated breakthrough of the first defensive belt would allow exploitation into the operational depth, where Soviet defenses would be thinner and German mobility could be decisive. Instead, each belt was as strongly defended as the previous one. At 1400 hours, the 2nd Panzer Division, driving hard along the eastern edge of the attack sector, reached what intelligence had identified as the 2nd Soviet defensive line near Bobruk. After 6 hours of continuous combat, they had advanced 4 kilometers. Their attack had cost 27 tanks destroyed or immobilized, and the Soviet positions ahead looked just as formidable as those they had fought through that morning. Model's response to the first day's results revealed his pessimism about the offensive's prospects. At 1500 hours, he ordered his corps commanders to consolidate positions, rather than continue attacking into the evening. This contradicted German operational doctrine, which emphasized maintaining momentum in breakthrough operations, accepting higher casualties to prevent defenders from reorganizing. But Model was already calculating differently. His forces had advanced perhaps 6 kilometers at maximum penetration, half the planned first-day objective of 12 kilometers. They'd suffered tank losses approaching 10% of engaged forces in a single day. At this rate, the 9th Army would exhaust its armor before reaching the operational depth where breakthrough supposedly became exploitation. Model's order to consolidate acknowledged what his offensive-minded subordinates didn't want to admit. They were grinding through Soviet defenses at costs that made reaching Kursk arithmetically impossible. The evening reports reaching Model's headquarters painted a picture of tactical competence achieving inadequate results. Every division had attacked as planned. Combined arms coordination, infantry, armor, artillery, engineers working together, had been generally excellent. German tactical proficiency, even against forewarned defenders in prepared positions, remained high. Units had adapted to Soviet defensive tactics, developed countermeasures, executed complex maneuvers under fire, yet these tactical successes had achieved minimal operational effect. The 47th Panzer Corps had penetrated 6 kilometers on a 10-kilometer front. Impressive in tactical terms, but operationally insufficient. The 41st Panzer Corps had managed 4 kilometers. The 23rd Corps on the flank had advanced only 3 kilometers against particularly stubborn Soviet resistance. Model studied the map, showing these penetrations, and calculated what everyone on his staff understood, but no one wanted to say aloud. At this rate, reaching the phase line where Soviet defenses supposedly thinned would take 2 weeks, by which time the 9th Army's armor would be completely destroyed. Soviet defensive doctrine was working exactly as planned, though at costs that troubled Soviet commanders even as they claimed tactical success. The Central Front had traded ground for time and German blood. They had allowed German forces to penetrate into pre-prepared killing zones while preserving their own operational reserves. Soviet casualties on July 5th in the Central Front's first defensive belt approached 6,000, serious but sustainable given the massive manpower reserves available. More troubling for Soviet planners was tank attrition. Soviet armored counterattacks launched in the afternoon to disrupt German consolidation had been locally successful but expensive. The 16th Tank Corps, attacking elements of the 9th Panzer Division near Ponyri, had lost 42 tanks in 3 hours of fighting, many to German anti-tank defenses, some to German airstrikes, others to mechanical breakdowns during the approach march. This rate of loss suggested that even victorious Soviet armored operations consume vehicles at rates that would matter in the coming counteroffensive phases. By 1800 hours, as both sides paused to reorganize and assess the day's fighting, the pattern for the entire battle had been established. German forces would attack with tactical skill into defensive systems that degraded their combat power faster than they could achieve meaningful operational results. Soviet forces would defend effectively at high cost, trading casualties for time while preserving their operational reserves for future counteroffensives. Neither side was executing its plan perfectly. But the asymmetry favored the Soviets. Their defensive plan required only that they inflict attrition faster than Germans could sustain, while the German offensive plan required breakthrough to operational depth that was receding with each kilometer purchased at such high cost. Model, reviewing the day's reports in his command bunker, dictated a message to Army Group Center headquarters that summarized the situation with characteristic bluntness. First day objectives not achieved. Enemy resistance stronger than anticipated. Losses in armor approaching 10%. Continuing attack as ordered, but prospects for rapid breakthrough are poor. That last sentence, its pessimism barely concealed beneath military formality, captured the entire battle's essence. The Ninth Army would continue attacking because those were its orders. But the commander prosecuting that attack already understood it couldn't succeed. 6 kilometers of hell had been purchased with blood and burning tanks, and another 54 kilometers remained before the objectives that might justify those costs. The mathematics didn't work, and everyone from model down to tank commanders like Schäufler could calculate that arithmetic even if they couldn't yet say it aloud. In July 5th, 1943, afternoon, near the village of Kashara, commander of heavy tank destroyer, Battalion 653, Major Glazermer watches his lead elephant, vehicle number 231, lumber into combat for the first time. The elephant is a technical marvel and a tactical monstrosity. 65 tons of steel and determination, or mounting an 88mm Piak-43 gun that can destroy any Soviet tank at 2,000 meters, protected by frontal armor up to 200 millimeters thick that makes it effectively immune to most Soviet anti-tank weapons. But, as Glazermer will discover over the next 72 hours, the elephant has one flaw so fundamental, so inexplicable, that it transforms the world's most powerful tank destroyer into a 65-ton coffin waiting for a funeral. The elephant has no machine gun, no defensive weapon against infantry, no way to protect itself once Soviet soldiers close to hand grenade range. And as Vehicle 231 advances toward its first engagement, that flaw is about to turn the opening battles of Kursk into a graveyard for Germany's most sophisticated armored weapon. Then the Elephant, originally designated Ferdinand after its designer, Ferdinand Porsche, represented the kind of technical overreach that plagued German weapons development throughout the war. Porsche had designed the vehicle as a proposed heavy tank for the Wehrmacht, but his design lost to the Henschel Tiger in competitive trials. Rather than waste the 90 partially completed chassis, Hitler personally ordered they be converted into heavy tank destroyers mounting the formidable 88mm Pak-43 gun. The resulting vehicle could kill a T-34 at ranges where the Soviet tank couldn't even see the Elephant, let alone damage it. But in converting the chassis from tank to tank destroyer, German designers eliminated the whole machine gun, and reasoning that the Elephant would operate behind infantry who would provide protection against enemy foot soldiers. This assumption reflected a profound misunderstanding of Eastern Front combat, where fluid battle lines and Soviet infiltration tactics meant armored vehicles often operated in environments where infantry support couldn't be guaranteed. The first day of Elephant combat operations demonstrated the weapon's lethality and vulnerability in equal measure. Soviet tankers attacking German positions near Kashara encountered Elephants for the first time and suffered catastrophic losses. A T-34 company commander later described the engagement. "We emerged from the tree line at 800 meters and began our attack. Then the German monsters fired. Our lead tank exploded. Not burned, exploded. The turret flew 15 meters. In 3 more tanks destroyed in less than 1 minute. We had never seen guns this powerful." The Elephants, positioned in a support role behind German infantry, demonstrated their design purpose perfectly. Long-range tank destruction with near immunity from return fire. By the end of July 5th, Elephants of Heavy Tank Destroyer, Battalion 653, claimed 47 Soviet tank kills for no losses of their own. But as German infantry advanced and the front line became fluid, the Elephant's fundamental flaw became apparent. July 6th, 1100 hours. Elephant number 231, having advanced to support German infantry attacking a Soviet strongpoint, becomes separated from its supporting troops when Soviet artillery forces the German infantrymen to take cover. The crew commander sees the threat, but has no weapon to counter it. 3 Soviet soldiers crawling through a drainage ditch toward the immobilized vehicle. They carry magnetic mines, crude but effective weapons designed to attach to armored vehicles and detonate with enough force to penetrate side armor. The Elephant crew has small arms, pistols and rifles stored inside the vehicle, but their firing ports are designed for anti-tank combat at long range, not close defense. The crew commander desperately attempts to traverse the turret, except the Elephant has no turret, only a fixed casemate. They try to maneuver the entire vehicle, but the terrain makes rapid movement impossible. The Soviet soldiers reach the vehicle, attach their mines to the engine deck, and detonate them. Elephant number 231 burns. Due its crew dying not from enemy tanks, but from enemy infantry it had no way to defend against. This pattern repeated throughout the Elephant battalions over the battle's first 3 days. The vehicles advanced, destroyed Soviet tanks with impressive efficiency, then became vulnerable when separated from infantry support, or when Soviet defenders infiltrated close to them. Some Elephants were immobilized by mines, then destroyed by infantry assault. Others broke down. The Elephant's electric transmission was notoriously unreliable and had to be abandoned when the recovery under fire proved impossible. Soviet tank hunting teams developed specific tactics for Elephant engagement. Avoid direct confrontation, wait for the vehicle to become separated from supporting infantry, then attack the tracks with anti-tank rifles or magnetic mines. Immobilize the vehicle and destroy it with satchel charges or close-range fire against the thinner rear and side armor. July 7th brought the nadir of Elephant operations. Heavy Tank Destroyer Battalion 654, operating near the village of Teplo, had begun the battle with 45 Elephants. By evening of the 7th, only 28 were operational. Of the 17 losses, only 4 had been destroyed by Soviet tanks. The rest had been immobilized by mines, destroyed by infantry assault, or abandoned due to mechanical breakdown with recovery impossible under fire. The battalion's war diary entry for July 7th is remarkable for its understatement. Enemy infantry tactics prove effective against vehicle. Request infantry escort at all times. At vehicle mobility and mechanical reliability below expectations. That bland military language concealed a tactical disaster. Germany's most powerful tank destroyer was being defeated not by superior enemy armor, but by foot soldiers with courage and explosives. The vehicle's designers had created a weapon optimized for one specific tactical scenario: long-range anti-tank combat in clear terrain with infantry support readily available, and found it employed in conditions where those assumptions rarely held. The Elephant was designed for the tank battles of France in 1940, or the open steppes of Ukraine in 1941. It was deployed in the mixed terrain of the Kursk salient in 1943, where forest lines provided cover for infiltration, where Soviet defenders had spent months preparing ambush positions, or where the fluid nature of breakthrough operations meant vehicles often operated beyond effective infantry support. The mismatch between design assumptions and combat reality turned a theoretical triumph of engineering into a practical catastrophe of procurement. German recovery teams, attempting to retrieve disabled Elephants for repair, faced a Soviet tactic specifically designed to prevent recovery, concentrating artillery and sniper fire on any disabled vehicle. Soviet commanders understood that an immobilized Elephant, if recovered, could be repaired and returned to combat. But if they could prevent recovery for 24 to 48 hours, mechanical components would be stripped by scavengers, weather would degrade systems, and the vehicle would become irretrievable. That Soviet snipers positioned themselves with clear sight lines to disabled Elephants, shooting anyone who approached. Soviet artillery observers registered coordinates on every disabled German vehicle and called fire on recovery attempts. Some Elephants sat immobilized for days, their crews long since evacuated, while German recovery teams attempted repeatedly to reach them under fire. Many were never recovered, their massive hulks left on the battlefield as monuments to the gap between theoretical capability and practical effectiveness. By July 8th, Elephant effectiveness had declined dramatically. The 89 vehicles committed to the Kursk offensive had destroyed an estimated 320 Soviet tanks, a remarkable kill ratio by any measure, but 39 of those Elephants were themselves destroyed or captured, a 44% loss rate in just 4 days of combat. The survivors were increasingly employed in purely static defensive roles, positioned in prepared positions with infantry security, their mobility abandoned in favor of using them as immobile artillery pieces. This wasn't what they'd been designed for. The Elephant was supposed to be a mobile tank destroyer, advancing with the attack, providing long-range anti-tank support for breakthrough operations. Instead, mechanical unreliability and vulnerability to infantry had transformed them into pillboxes. Expensive, technically sophisticated pillboxes with guns far too powerful for that role. Hitler's personal obsession with the Elefant made acknowledging its failure institutionally difficult. The Führer had personally ordered the vehicle's development. O had insisted on its deployment at Kursk and had declared it would prove decisive. Field reports describing the vehicle's vulnerabilities were received at the highest levels, but generated no immediate response. Not until after Kursk, when the catastrophic loss rates could no longer be ignored, did German military procurement authorize modifications, installation of a bow machine gun, additional armor for the engine deck, improved reliability in the transmission system. These modified vehicles were renamed Ferdinand and served more effectively in Italy later in the war. But at Kursk, the unmodified elephants represented everything wrong with German weapons procurement. Technically brilliant, tactically naive, strategically wasteful. The elephant's failure at Kursk illustrated a broader problem in German armored warfare by 1943. The Wehrmacht could still design and build weapons that outperformed Soviet equivalents in specific technical parameters: armor thickness, gun penetration, optical quality. But they couldn't build those weapons in sufficient numbers, couldn't ensure their mechanical reliability, and couldn't guarantee the tactical conditions under which their technical advantages would matter. An elephant that could kill a T-34 at 2,000 meters was useless if mechanical breakdown immobilized it at kilometer zero, or if Soviet infantry destroyed it with hand grenades at range 0. The mathematics of armored warfare had shifted. Quality still mattered, but quantity, reliability, and tactical appropriateness mattered more. The Soviets understood this. They built thousands of T-34s that were individually inferior to German tanks, but collectively overwhelming. They designed weapons for the conditions of actual combat, not for theoretical superiority in isolated parameters. The elephant's graveyard, those dozens of burned and abandoned hulks scattered across the Kursk battlefield, marked not just the failure of a single weapon system, but the obsolescence of an entire approach to armored warfare. The Germans were still designing perfect weapons for perfect battles that no longer existed, while the Soviets were designing adequate weapons for the messy, brutal reality of industrial warfare on the Eastern Front. And in that contest, adequacy in quantity was defeating perfection in scarcity with a decisiveness that no amount of armor thickness could overcome. For July 6, 1943, 0600 hours. The villages of Ponyri and Ponyri Station, collections of wooden houses and brick buildings clustered around a minor railway junction, 15 kilometers south of the German start line, appear unremarkable on tactical maps. The station handles local agricultural traffic, the village's house perhaps 2,000 civilians, and the terrain offers no natural defensive advantages. Yet over the next 7 days, these villages will consume an entire German infantry division, destroy a Soviet rifle corps, and become the scene of some of the most savage close quarters fighting on the Eastern Front. The German 292nd Infantry Division begins its attack on Ponyri with 10,400 men. By July 12th, it will count 6,100 effectives, a casualty rate approaching 40% for a single objective measuring barely 3 kilometers across. Soviet defenders will suffer even more terribly. The Soviet 79th Rifle Division and supporting units will lose approximately 15,000 men holding these insignificant villages. Ponyri isn't strategically decisive, it's simply in the way. But in the arithmetic of attrition that defines Kursk, being in the way is enough to become decisive. The initial German assault on July 6th demonstrated the terrible efficiency of Soviet defensive preparation meeting German tactical expertise. German artillery preparation began at 0600, delivering 15 minutes of concentrated high explosive and smoke onto Soviet positions in and around Ponyri Station. At 0615, the 292nd Infantry Division's assault battalions advanced, supported by tanks from the 9th Panzer Division. They expected to encounter resistance, Soviet defensive positions were visible from German forward observation posts, but they expected to break through with the combined arms tactics that had served German forces well throughout the war. Instead, they encountered a defensive system designed to absorb and degrade attack without breaking. Soviet artillery, positioned in depth and largely untouched by German counter-battery fire, began responding with pre-registered defensive fires. Soviet anti-tank guns, positioned in the basements of brick buildings, engaged German tanks from ranges where their muzzle flashes were invisible in the smoke and dust. Soviet infantry, dug into positions that survived the German bombardment, waited until German infantry was within 100 meters before opening fire with machine guns and automatic rifles. By 0800 hours, the German advance had covered approximately 1 kilometer. Reasonable progress by Kursk standards, but achieved at costs that suggested this wouldn't be a normal breakthrough operation. The 292nd Infantry Division reported 600 casualties, mostly from Soviet artillery and small arms fire. The supporting 9th Panzer Division reported 12 tanks destroyed or immobilized, most to anti-tank guns firing from positions in Ponyri's buildings. More troubling was the report from forward battalion commanders. They were fighting for individual buildings, not advancing across open terrain. The battle for Ponyri was going to be urban combat, and urban combat on the Eastern Front in 1943 was warfare at its most primitive and lethal. July 8th marked the battle's transformation into something approaching the Stalingrad nightmare that haunted German commanders. Soviet tanks from the 16th Tank Corps, ordered to counterattack to relieve pressure on Ponyri's defenders, drove directly into the village in a point-blank range engagement with German armor. T-34s and Panzer IVs fought at ranges of 50 to 300 meters, distances where armor meant little, where the first shot usually killed, where tactical finesse gave way to mechanical reliability and crew desperation. A German tank commander in the 9th Panzer Division described the engagement. "We shot a T-34 at 70 meters. It brewed up. Or its ammunition cooked off. The explosion set fire to a building. The building collapsed onto another tank. Hours. The crew bailed out. Soviet infantry shot 3 of them before they could reach cover. This wasn't combat. This was murder in a burning room." The ruins of Ponyri became a labyrinth of knocked-out vehicles, collapsed buildings, and fortified strongpoints that neither side could clear. The Soviet defense of Ponyri featured a stubborn refusal to yield ground, even when tactical logic suggested withdrawal. German combat engineers, attempting to reduce Soviet strongpoints systematically, discovered that capturing a building didn't mean controlling it. Soviet defenders would retreat to basements, then counterattack through tunnels connecting buildings. The positions that German infantry cleared in the morning would be reoccupied by Soviet troops overnight. The most extreme case was a brick building German units designated House 47, a Soviet strongpoint that anchored defensive positions in the center of Ponyri Station. German engineers spent 2 days tunneling under the building, then detonated 300 kilograms of explosives on July 10th. The explosion collapsed the entire structure, killing an estimated 30 to 40 Soviet defenders. 2 hours later, Soviet infantry counterattacked through the rubble and re-established positions in what remained of the building's basement. The Germans had destroyed the building, but hadn't eliminated its defensive value. The intensity of combat at Ponyri generated casualty rates that approached the worst battles of World War I. German infantry companies that began the battle with 120 to 140 men were down to 40 to 60 effectives within 3 days. Soviet rifle regiments, nominally composed of 2,000 men, were reduced to battalion strength, 600 to 800 soldiers, and continued fighting. Medical services on both sides were overwhelmed. German aid stations reported treating wounded men under artillery fire, lacking sufficient medical supplies, forced to make triage decisions between soldiers who might survive and soldiers who would die regardless of treatment. Soviet medical services, backed by enormous reserves of personnel and equipment, could evacuate wounded men to hospitals in the rear, but the scale of casualties exceeded even their capacity. Witnesses described field hospitals where the wounded outnumbered the medical staff by ratios of 50 to 1, where life-saving surgery was impossible for most casualties, where morphine and blood plasma ran out within the first 48 hours of battle. July 12th, the official last day of the German offensive, found both sides still fighting for the same ruins they had contested 6 days earlier. German forces controlled perhaps 60% of Ponyri, an advance of less than 2 kilometers from their July 6 start positions. Soviet forces held the remaining 40% and showed no signs of collapse despite catastrophic casualties. The 292nd Infantry Division, ordered to take Ponyri Station, had lost over 4,000 men trying, and Ponyri Station remained in Soviet hands. The cost-benefit calculation was simple and damning. Germany had destroyed an entire infantry division's combat effectiveness to capture a village that had no strategic value except as an obstacle on the road to objectives Germany would never reach. The Soviets had destroyed a rifle corps defending that village, but they had tens of thousands of reinforcements available while German replacements were measured in hundreds. Model's visit to Ponyri on July 9th, a rare instance of an army commander personally visiting the tactical combat zone, revealed his awareness that the battle was lost even as the fighting continued. He toured the forward positions with the 292nd Infantry Division's commander, speaking with exhausted soldiers, observing the ruins, studying the tactical situation. His conclusion, that they delivered to the division commander with characteristic directness, was bleak. You're winning every engagement and losing the battle. Continue until further orders, but prepare for withdrawal. That assessment, winning tactically while losing operationally, applied not just to Ponyri, but to the entire Ninth Army's offensive. German forces were executing combined arms tactics effectively, destroying Soviet defensive positions methodically, advancing against prepared defenses despite heavy casualties. But none of it mattered because the operational objective, breakthrough to Kursk, was receding faster than German forces advanced. Soviet perspective on Ponyri, documented in the Soviet 79th Rifle Division's war diary, reflected a similar tactical operational disconnect, but with opposite implications. The Soviet commanders acknowledged the division was being destroyed, holding Ponyri, but they also noted that every day German forces spent fighting for the village was a day they weren't advancing toward Kursk, a day Soviet operational reserves had to prepare counteroffensives, a day German armor and infantry were being ground down in attritional combat. The deputy commander of the Central Front, reviewing casualty reports from Ponyri, reportedly stated, "We're trading 10 Soviet soldiers for 8 Germans in a fight where we have 100 to their 10. That's mathematics I can accept." The calculation was brutal and accurate. Soviet manpower reserves could sustain the Ponyri casualty rates. German reserves couldn't. The fighting at Ponyri also demonstrated the psychological breaking points of modern combat. Soldiers on both sides, subjected to days of continuous combat in ruins, under constant artillery fire, witnessing casualties at scales that numbed human comprehension, began showing signs of combat exhaustion that contemporary medical services barely understood. German medical reports mentioned soldiers with exhaustion collapse, men who were physically uninjured but mentally unable to continue functioning. Soviet Commissar reports noted similar issues, describing soldiers who had stopped following orders not from cowardice but from psychological shutdown. The term battle fatigue wouldn't be widely used until later in the war, but the phenomenon was evident at Ponyri. Human beings have limits to the horror they can process and the violence they can endure. And a week of urban combat in burning ruins approaches those limits regardless of training or motivation. By the battle's end, Ponyri had become a symbol of Kursk's larger dynamic, German tactical excellence grinding against Soviet operational depth in a contest where excellence couldn't overcome mathematics. The ruins of the village, and they were total ruins by July 12th, barely a single building intact, contained the wreckage of both armies' illusions. German forces had demonstrated they could still execute complex combined arms operations against prepared defenses, but they'd also demonstrated those operations consumed combat power faster than they achieved operational objectives. Soviet forces had demonstrated they could absorb German attacks through defensive depth and replacement capacity, but they'd also demonstrated the human cost of that absorption approached levels that, if sustained indefinitely, would exhaust even Soviet reserves. Ponyri wasn't Stalingrad. The battle didn't last months, didn't involve encirclement, didn't end in German surrender. but it shared Stalingrad's essential character: positional warfare where attacking forces couldn't break through and defending forces wouldn't break down, where both sides suffered terribly for objectives whose value existed only in their denial to the enemy. The ruins of Ponyri would remain a battlefield scar for years, a landscape so thoroughly destroyed that post-war reconstruction simply built new villages nearby rather than attempt to resurrect what had been obliterated. The 7-day battle left a permanent mark on the ground and on the two armies that fought there, a monument to the question that haunted all of Kursk: when does determination become futility, and how do you know the difference when you're living it? July 9th, 1943. Morning. In the 9th Army's command bunker, General Feldmarschall Walter Model faces a decision that epitomizes everything contradictory about his approach to Operation Citadel. His chief of staff has just presented the morning situation report. German forces have advanced 10 to 12 kilometers at maximum penetration after 4 days of continuous attack, roughly 20% of the distance to their intermediate objectives. Tank strength has declined from 590 operational vehicles on July 5th to approximately 420, a 29% reduction in combat power. All infantry divisions report casualties ranging from 15 to 35%, with ammunition consumption running 40% above planned rates. Standing across the map table from Model is General Joachim Lemelsen, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, arguing passionately for commitment of the 4th Panzer Division, one of Model's last uncommitted reserves. Lemelsen insists that one more push, one more concentration of armor, might achieve the breakthrough that's been tantalizingly close for 4 days. Model studies the map in silence, then delivers his answer: commit 4th Panzer to the Ponyri sector, but understand, when we commit this reserve, we have nothing left between us and catastrophe. The reserve structure Model had carefully built during April and May was designed for flexibility and survival, not for offensive exploitation. While most German armies attacking in Operation Citadel held perhaps 15 to 20% of their forces in reserve, Model had maintained nearly 40% in reserve positions when the offensive began. 6 full divisions, including 2 panzer divisions, kept well behind the start line. This generated friction with Army Group Center headquarters, where commanders schooled in traditional German offensive doctrine saw Model's reserve retention as timidity bordering on defeatism. The purpose of reserves in breakthrough operations, they argued, was to exploit success once initial penetration was achieved. Model's positioning of reserves 40 to 60 kilometers behind the attack axis made exploitation impossible. By the time reserves moved forward, any window of opportunity would have closed. Yet Model's counter-argument revealed his fundamental pessimism about Citadel's prospects. Reserves positioned for exploitation assume breakthrough succeeds. I'm positioning reserves to prevent disaster when breakthrough fails. The debate over 4th Panzer Division's commitment crystallized these competing philosophies. Lemelsen, commander of the Corps, making the deepest penetration into Soviet defenses, saw the situation through the lens of offensive momentum. His forces had broken through the first Soviet defensive belt, were engaging the second, and with proper reinforcement might achieve operational breakthrough. The 4th Panzer Division, fresh at full strength, with approximately 160 tanks, could provide the mass necessary to overwhelm Soviet defensive reserves and achieve the kind of deep penetration that would justify the offensive's costs. Every day Model delayed committing this reserve was a day Soviet forces used to strengthen defenses and position operational reserves. From Lemelsen's perspective, holding the 4th Panzer in reserve while the offensive stalled was the surest way to guarantee failure. Model's perspective, shaped by 2 years of defensive battles on the Eastern Front, calculated differently. He'd studied the morning reports with attention to details his offensive-minded subordinates dismissed. Soviet defensive resistance wasn't weakening. If anything, it was intensifying as German forces penetrated deeper into prepared defensive zones. The rate of advance was declining: 6 kilometers on July 5th, 3 kilometers on July 6th, 2 kilometers on July 7th, 1 kilometer on July 8th. This wasn't the pattern of breakthrough, it was the pattern of offensive culmination. More troubling were intelligence reports of massive Soviet force concentrations north of the Oral salient, armies that weren't engaged in the defensive battle at Kursk, armies that appeared to be preparing for counteroffensive operations against the Ninth Army's flanks and rear. Committing the 4th Panzer Division to support an offensive that was already failing would leave nothing to defend against the counteroffensive model knew was coming. The mathematics of reserve commitment revealed the trap model found himself in. The Ninth Army had begun the offensive with 23 divisions. Way after 4 days of combat, all but 6 were heavily engaged, meaning they'd suffered casualties, consumed supplies, and were fighting in forward positions where they couldn't easily disengage. Those 6 reserve divisions represented Model's operational flexibility. But flexibility meant different things, depending on whether you were thinking offensively or defensively. For offensive operations, reserves were exploitation forces meant to turn tactical success into operational breakthrough. For defensive operations, reserves were security forces meant to block enemy counterattacks and cover withdrawals. Model couldn't prepare the same reserves for both missions simultaneously. By July 9th, he had to choose. Commit reserves to sustain a failing offensive, or preserve them to defend against the coming Soviet counterattack. His choice to commit 4th Panzer Division represented a compromise. Give the offensive one more chance while accepting that this commitment left him dangerously exposed. July 10th, 1300 hours. The 4th Panzer Division begins its movement forward to reinforce operations around Ponyri. The division's 160 tanks and 7,000 infantry represent the Ninth Army's last uncommitted armored reserve. The movement itself reveals the challenges of Eastern Front logistics. The division must travel 45 kilometers from its reserve positions to the combat zone, along roads congested with supply vehicles moving forward and casualty evacuation columns moving rearward. German military police struggle to maintain traffic flow, while Soviet partisans interdict the supply lines with ambushes and demolitions. It's thought the division's advance guard reaches the Ponyri sector by late afternoon, but it takes until July 11th morning for the entire division to concentrate. 20 hours between commitment order and combat effectiveness, and in those 20 hours, Soviet defenders reinforced their positions, and Soviet intelligence identified the new German formation preparing to attack. The 4th Panzer Division's attack on July 11th demonstrated both German tactical proficiency and the operational futility that proficiency faced. The division attacked Soviet positions east of Ponyri at 0600 hours with textbook combined arms coordination, artillery preparation, infantry assault to fix Soviet defenses, armor exploitation through any weak points, all supported by ground attack aircraft. The attack achieved its immediate tactical objectives, penetrating 2 kilometers and destroying an estimated 30 Soviet tanks. But by afternoon, the advance had stalled against Soviet reserves moving forward to counterattack. The 4th Panzer Division had achieved what Lemelson had promised, a tactical success. It hadn't achieved what Model knew was needed, a breakthrough that changed the operational situation. And in the process of achieving that tactical success, the division had consumed itself as a reserve. The Ninth Army now had 5 uncommitted divisions, of which only one, the 18th Panzer Division, was an armored formation. Model's reserve cushion had shrunk to the point where one more crisis would leave him with nothing. July 11th evening brought Model the intelligence he'd been dreading. Soviet forces north of the Ural salient, armies the Soviets designated as the Bryansk and Western Fronts, had begun intensive artillery preparations and probing attacks against German defensive positions. Reconnaissance reported Soviet tank concentrations totaling over 1,200 vehicles, clearly preparing for major offensive operations. The scale of forces involved suggested this wasn't a local counterattack, but a full operational offensive designed to encircle the entire Ural salient and potentially trap the Ninth Army against the Kursk defenses. Model had prepared for this. His defensive lines behind the attack sectors, his dispersed supply dumps, his withdrawal routes all reflected his expectation that Soviet counteroffensive was coming. But he'd hoped to have more reserves available when it came. The commitment of the 4th Panzer Division, while tactically justified, had left him operationally exposed at precisely the moment Soviet counteroffensive was beginning. The telephone conversation between Model and Hitler on July 11th evening has been reconstructed from multiple sources, though no verbatim transcript exists. Model reported the day's situation: limited gains around Ponyri, commitment of final major reserve, intelligence indicating imminent large-scale Soviet counteroffensive against Army Group Center's flanks. Hitler's response, according to Model's chief of staff who overheard the conversation, was unequivocal. The attack must continue. Success is near. Manstein is achieving breakthrough in the south. The enemy is about to break. One more effort will decide the battle. Model's response, delivered with the bluntness that characterized his relationship with Hitler, was reported as, "Mein Führer, near is not enough. I can continue attacking, but I cannot promise success, and I must prepare to defend against counteroffensive." Hitler authorized continued attack. He didn't authorize preparation for withdrawal. Model, following his usual practice of interpreting orders flexibly, would do both. The reserve paradox Model, faced by July 11th, was unsolvable within the framework of offensive operations. He'd built the deepest reserve system on the Eastern Front, specifically to provide operational flexibility. But the demands of offensive warfare, the need to sustain momentum, to reinforce success, to overwhelm defensive positions through mass, consumed reserves faster than breakthrough could justify. Model had committed his reserves intelligently, at points where tactical success seemed possible, always maintaining some cushion against disaster. But the cumulative effect of those commitments, even intelligent ones, was the same. By the time the offensive stalled, he had nothing left to exploit success if it came, and barely enough to prevent disaster when Soviet counteroffensive began. The system he'd built to survive failure couldn't simultaneously support success. This wasn't a flaw in Model's planning. It was a fundamental characteristic of German strategic position by 1943. Germany lacked the resources to sustain extended offensive operations while maintaining adequate defensive reserves. Model understood this in a way Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command didn't or wouldn't acknowledge. And Soviet operational planning exploited this German dilemma with brutal effectiveness. Soviet defensive doctrine at Kursk was explicitly designed to consume German reserves through attrition. Every day of German offensive operations, every tactical success that required commitment of German reserves, degraded German capacity to respond to Soviet counteroffensives. The Red Army was accepting terrible casualties in the defensive battle. The Central Front alone would suffer over 70,000 casualties defending against Model's attack. But those casualties were achieving a strategic purpose. They were forcing Germany to commit reserves to sustain an offensive that couldn't achieve breakthrough, leaving Germany vulnerable when Soviet operational reserves entered the battle in counteroffensive operations. Soviet planners had calculated this trade-off and found it acceptable. Trade Soviet soldiers defending Kursk for German operational flexibility across the entire theater. The calculation was harsh, arguably callous, but militarily sound. By nightfall on July 11th, Model's situation embodied every paradox that had defined his preparation for Citadel. He'd prepared defensively for an offensive and found those defensive preparations now essential to survival. He'd maintained deep reserves to provide flexibility and found that flexibility consumed by the demands of offensive operations. He'd predicted the offensive would fail and found himself committed to continuing that offensive even as prediction became reality. He'd built an army that could defend magnificently, but discovered that defending successfully after attacking unsuccessfully might be impossible. The reserve paradox wasn't just a tactical problem about where to position divisions. It was a strategic metaphor for Germany's position in the summer of 1943, committed to offensives that consumed resources needed for defense, facing an enemy with resources to sustain both defense and offense simultaneously, fighting a war where tactical excellence no longer compensated for strategic insufficiency. Model understood all of this. Understanding didn't give him solutions. It only gave him clarity about the choices ahead, none of them good, and all of them purchased with the lives of soldiers who deserved better than the strategic bankruptcy they were being asked to redeem through courage. The reserve paradox would resolve itself within 48 hours, but not through German success. It would resolve through Soviet counteroffensive, turning Model's greatest fear into operational reality. July 8, 1943, evening. 40 kilometers behind the Ninth Army's forward positions, senior mechanic Ernst Backe stands in a field workshop that's become a monument to mechanical failure. Around him, 63 tanks await repair, Panzer IVs with thrown tracks, Panthers with burned-out transmissions, Panzer IIIs with damaged engines. The workshop, designed to handle perhaps 15 vehicles at once, is overwhelmed. Mechanics work 18-hour shifts. It's sleeping on the ground beside vehicles they're repairing, surviving on cold rations because nobody has time to organize proper meals. Bake has been tracking the repair backlog since the offensive began. The numbers tell a story that terrifies him more than Soviet shells. On July 5th, the workshop received 22 vehicles needing repair. On July 6th, 31. On July 7th, 43. Today, 49. The rate of mechanical breakdown is accelerating, and the rate of completed repairs is declining. Within 3 days, if trends continue, the workshop will be receiving more broken tanks per day than the Ninth Army has operational tanks. Germany isn't just losing the battle against Soviet defenses, it's losing the battle against mechanical entropy. There's the mechanical attrition devastating German armored forces at Kursk, reflected problems that went far beyond the immediate battle. German tank production in early 1943 prioritized sophistication over reliability. The Panther tank, introduced at Kursk with great fanfare, featured excellent armor and firepower, but suffered catastrophic mechanical problems. The Maybach HL 230 engine, producing 700 horsepower to move the 45-ton tank, generated tremendous heat that regularly caused engine fires. The transmission, designed for a lighter vehicle, failed repeatedly under the stress of the Panther's weight. Official German records acknowledge that Panther operational readiness rates at Kursk averaged 35%, meaning at any given moment. Roughly two-thirds of Panthers were immobilized by mechanical problems rather than combat damage. Tank crews learned to dread not Soviet anti-tank guns, but their own vehicles' unreliability. July 10th supply report to Model's headquarters revealed the scope of the logistics crisis supporting the Ninth Army's offensive. The Army required approximately 120 replacement tank engines to maintain operational readiness at planned levels. Berlin headquarters promised 40 engines. By July 10th, none had arrived. Supply officers calculated that at current rates of mechanical attrition and available replacement parts, the Ninth Army's tank strength would decline by approximately 8% per day regardless of combat losses. This wasn't sustainable. In a 2-week offensive, the minimum time German planners had calculated would be necessary to reach Kursk. Mechanical attrition alone would reduce German tank strength by over 50%, even if the Soviets never fired a shot. Add combat losses, and the mathematics became catastrophic. German armor was hemorrhaging combat power faster than logistics could replace it. The specific breakdown patterns revealed systematic weaknesses in German tank design and maintenance doctrine. Tracks and road wheels, subjected to heavy loads on poor roads and rough terrain, failed regularly. The Ninth Army reported that track damage or failure accounted for roughly 40% of tank immobilizations. Vehicles that were technically repairable but required recovery under fire, transport to workshops, and installation of replacement tracks that often weren't available. Engine and transmission failures accounted for another 35% of immobilizations. These were more serious because they often required complete engine or transmission replacement, work that took workshop crews 40 to 60 hours per vehicle. Combat damage accounted for perhaps 25% of tank losses, a remarkably low proportion that suggested the Soviets were destroying fewer German tanks than German logistics was abandoning. The human cost of mechanical attrition extended beyond combat effectiveness to morale and psychological exhaustion. Tank crews found themselves fighting 2 battles simultaneously, against Soviet defenses and against their own vehicles' tendency to fail at critical moments. A Panzer IV commander in the 2nd Panzer Division described the experience. "We attacked Soviet positions. Our tank threw a track 200 meters from the objective. We sat immobilized under fire for 3 hours until recovery. Repaired, we attacked the next day." Transmission failure. Recovered, repaired, attacked the third day. Engine overheated and caught fire. We escaped, but our tank burned. They issued us a replacement. It had already been repaired twice. We didn't trust it. This cycle, attack, breakdown, recovery, repair, attack, breakdown, generated a psychological exhaustion that combat alone couldn't explain. Crews lost confidence not just in tactical success, but in basic mechanical reliability. Soviet tank losses during the same period were proportionally similar, but operationally different. Soviet defensive forces lost approximately 1,100 tanks in the Central Front sector during the first 8 days of German attack. But Soviet doctrine treated tanks as expendable weapons, not precision instruments. T-34s were designed for reliability and ease of repair, not mechanical sophistication. Their relatively simple construction, compared to German tanks, meant field repairs were faster and required less specialized expertise. More importantly, Soviet operational reserves included approximately 1,500 fresh tanks, positioned to reinforce the defensive battle or begin counteroffensive operations. Soviet forces could sustain heavy tank losses because replacement capacity existed. German forces couldn't sustain equivalent losses because replacement capacity didn't exist. The supply crisis extended beyond replacement vehicles to every category of supply the Ninth Army needed to sustain offensive operations. Fuel consumption exceeded planned rates by approximately 25%, partially because stop and start combat operations consumed more fuel than sustained advances, partially because poor roads and rough terrain reduced fuel efficiency. Ammunition consumption, especially artillery ammunition, ran 40% above planned rates because German artillery had to engage more targets more often than pre-battle planning anticipated. Food supplies were adequate, but distribution was problematic. Forward units often went days without hot meals because supply networks couldn't reach them through Soviet artillery fire and partisan interdiction. Medical supplies, especially blood plasma and morphine, always ran dangerously low by July 10th, as casualty rates exceeded planning assumptions. The partisan war against German supply lines created a third level of attrition beyond combat and mechanical losses. Soviet partisan units operating in the Ninth Army's rear area conducted an average of 12 to 15 attacks per day on supply convoys, rail lines, and supply dumps. Most attacks were relatively small: a mine on a road, a derailment, an ambush of a supply truck, but the cumulative effect was a 15 to 20% reduction in supply efficiency. Supplies that left German rear area depots didn't reliably reach frontline units. Some were destroyed by partisans. Some were diverted to defend against partisan attacks. Some simply got lost in the confusion of combat logistics. A model had anticipated this problem and had established dispersed supply dumps along multiple routes, but even his thorough preparation couldn't fully compensate for operating in an environment where every supply route was contested. July 11th morning, strength report for the 2nd Panzer Division illustrated the cumulative effect of mechanical hemorrhage on German combat power. The division had begun Operation Citadel on July 5th with 140 operational tanks. By July 11th, 41 tanks remained operational. Of the 99 non-operational tanks, approximately 35 had been destroyed in combat and written off as total losses. The remaining 64 were theoretically repairable, but many had been immobilized in forward areas where recovery under fire was impossible. The many required parts that weren't available, and many would require workshop time that exceeded the battle's expected duration. The division's effective combat power had declined by 70% in 6 days, and less than half that decline resulted from Soviet action. German armor was defeating itself through the cumulative effect of mechanical failures that peacetime maintenance could have prevented, but that combat operations accelerated beyond repair capacity. The comparison with Soviet logistics revealed one of the war's fundamental asymmetries. Soviet logistics operated on the principle of adequate sufficiency rather than German pursuit of technical excellence. Soviet trucks were simpler than German equivalents, but more reliable. Soviet tank maintenance was less sophisticated, but more effective because it prioritized getting vehicles back into combat over perfect repair. Soviet supply doctrine accepted high wastage rates, supplies lost to German bombing, partisan interdiction, administrative confusion, and compensated through massive overproduction. The Soviet system was inefficient by any theoretical standard, but it worked because it was designed for the realities of industrial warfare, where reliability mattered more than sophistication. The German system was efficient in theory, but brittle in practice because it couldn't tolerate the disruptions and unexpected demands of sustained combat operations. By July 12th, when Operation Citadel officially ended, the Ninth Army's mechanical condition was perhaps more significant than its tactical position. Model's forces held a penetration 12 kilometers deep into Soviet defenses, modest but respectable given the defensive strength they had faced. But his armored strength had declined from 590 operational tanks on July 5th to approximately 250 operational tanks on July 12th. That 57% reduction in combat power meant the Ninth Army couldn't sustain offensive operations, even if ordered to continue. More critically for the coming defensive battles, that same mechanical attrition meant German armor couldn't execute the kind of mobile defensive operations that Model's doctrine emphasized. Tanks that wouldn't run couldn't conduct fighting withdrawals. Vehicles that couldn't be recovered couldn't be repaired. The mechanical hemorrhage that had bled German combat power during the offensive would continue bleeding it during the defensive battle, creating a downward spiral where declining strength led to declining effectiveness, which led to further declining strength. Model had prepared for tactical defeat. He hadn't fully prepared for mechanical collapse. And in the battles ahead, that mechanical vulnerability would matter as much as any Soviet tactical action. July 12th, 1943, 1500 hours. General Feldmarschall Walter Model stands before the situation map at 9th Army headquarters, listening to a report that confirms his worst predictions. Soviet forces have launched Operation Kutuzov, a massive offensive against Army Group Center's positions north and east of the Ural salient. Yet the scale is staggering. 3 Soviet fronts, comprising approximately 1.2 million men and 2,400 tanks, are attacking German defensive positions that Model had warned were dangerously weak. The attack began at 0600 hours with an artillery preparation that Soviet sources describe as the heaviest of the war to date, 26,000 guns and mortars delivering fires against German positions. Forward units report multiple Soviet breakthrough penetrations, with Soviet tank armies beginning exploitation operations. Model's worst fear, a Soviet counteroffensive beginning, while the Ninth Army is committed to offensive operations and has no reserves to respond, is now reality. And he turns to his chief of staff and delivers a single question. How long before Soviet forces reach positions that threaten encirclement of the entire army? The answer, perhaps 48 to 72 hours. Model had predicted this moment with such accuracy that his staff had prepared contingency plans weeks earlier, but prediction didn't equal preparation, and preparation didn't guarantee survival. The Ninth Army was stretched across a 12-kilometer deep penetration into Soviet defensive positions around Kursk, with all but one division heavily engaged and at reduced strength. Simultaneously, German defensive positions protecting the Ninth Army's flanks and rear were being assaulted by Soviet forces that outnumbered German defenders by margins approaching 4-1 in some sectors. The Model faced the operational nightmare every commander dreads, fighting in 2 directions simultaneously with inadequate forces for either mission. He couldn't continue attacking toward Kursk. His forces were exhausted, his armor depleted, and Soviet defenses showed no sign of collapse. He couldn't immediately disengage and defend against Operation Kutuzov. His forces were too committed, too dispersed, and too intermixed with Soviet forces to execute rapid withdrawal. The operational art required to survive the next 72 hours would test everything Model had learned in 2 years of defensive warfare. The formal order ending Operation Citadel came not from Model, but from Hitler, delivered via telephone to Model and Manstein on the evening of July 12th. But the wording of Hitler's order revealed the Wehrmacht's institutional difficulty, acknowledging failure. Rather than explicitly canceling the offensive, Hitler ordered operations suspended to allow redeployment of forces to Italy, where the Allies had invaded Sicily on July 10th. This formulation preserved the fiction that Citadel had been abandoned for strategic reasons rather than because it had failed operationally. Model, listening to Hitler's justification, understood the psychological necessity of this framing, but found it operationally irrelevant. Whether the offensive was suspended or failed mattered less than the immediate tactical reality. The Ninth Army had to disengage from offensive operations, execute a fighting withdrawal to prepare defensive positions, and then defend against a Soviet operational offensive, all while maintaining cohesion under pressure. The order model issued to subordinate commanders at 1600 hours on July 12th was characteristically direct. Operation Citadel ends. Ninth Army transitions to defensive operations. All units prepare for withdrawal to Phase Line Hagen. Movement begins tonight. The statistics defining the Ninth Army's offensive achievement were modest to the point of tragedy. Maximum penetration, 12 kilometers. Planned penetration for breakthrough to operational depth, 60 kilometers. Time required, 8 days. Planned time, 4 to 6 days. Casualties, approximately 25,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Tank strength, declined from 590 to 250 operational, a 57% reduction. Any Soviet casualties in the Central Front sector facing Model's attack, approximately 70,000. The cost-exchange ratio, roughly 1 German casualty for 2.8 Soviet casualties, seemed favorable by arithmetic standards. But arithmetic wasn't the relevant measure. Germany couldn't replace its losses at the rate required to sustain that exchange ratio. The Soviet Union could. Model's offensive had achieved every tactical objective that mattered, except the only one that did: breakthrough to operational depth that would justify the costs. Field Marshal von Manstein, commanding the southern pincer of Operation Citadel, had achieved marginally better results than Model. His forces had penetrated approximately 35 kilometers and had inflicted even heavier casualties on Soviet defenders. Manstein argued to Hitler that his attack should continue. One more push might achieve breakthrough. Model's response to this argument, delivered in a conference call with Hitler and Manstein on July 13th, revealed his fundamental disagreement with offensive-minded commanders about what was possible. Field Marshal Manstein has achieved impressive tactical success, but tactical success that doesn't achieve operational objectives is operationally irrelevant. We're measuring our advance in kilometers when we need to measure it in destroyed enemy divisions and collapsed defensive systems. The enemy isn't collapsing. We are. Hitler sided with Manstein rhetorically, but with Model operationally. The offensive would end, and forces would redeploy for defensive operations. Soviet Operation Kutuzov, the counteroffensive that began on July 12th, represented the culmination of Soviet operational planning that had been developing since spring. While German forces attacked into prepared defensive positions around Kursk, Soviet operational reserves, entire armies that hadn't participated in the defensive battle, prepared to attack the flanks of the German salients. The timing was precise. Begin counteroffensive operations at the moment German offensive operations stalled, catching German forces overextended, depleted, and with reserves already committed. The scale was unprecedented. 3 Soviet fronts, 9 armies, with support from partisan operations disrupting German rear areas. The objective was operationally ambitious: collapse the entire Oral salient, potentially encircling Army Group Center and destroying multiple German armies. And Soviet commanders understood they were attempting what the Germans had done so successfully in 1941, a massive encirclement operation that would destroy enemy forces through operational maneuver rather than tactical attrition. Model's ability to recognize the culminating point, the moment when continuing an offensive guaranteed more losses than possible gains, distinguished him from more optimistic commanders. Many Wehrmacht generals, schooled in the offensive successes of early war years, retained psychological investment in offensive operations that made acknowledging failure difficult. Model had no such psychological investment. He'd never believed Citadel would succeed, had prepared for its failure, and could acknowledge that failure without the cognitive dissonance that paralyzed other commanders. His July 13th morning orders to subordinate commanders reflected this clarity. The offensive has failed. All subsequent operations focus on survival of the army as a fighting force. We trade ground for cohesion. We preserve combat power over position. We survive to defend again. This wasn't defeatism. It was ruthless operational realism. The transition from offensive to defensive operations required the Ninth Army to execute movements of extraordinary complexity under pressure. Forces that had been advancing south toward Kursk now had to withdraw north toward prepared defensive positions, all while Soviet forces attacked from the east and northeast. Units intermixed with Soviet defenders in places like Ponyri had to disengage without allowing Soviet forces to turn disengagement into rout. And as tank forces depleted by week-long combat had to provide rearguard coverage for infantry withdrawals while preserving enough combat power to defend subsequently. Artillery units had to displace from offensive firing positions to defensive positions while maintaining fire support for covering forces. Supply units had to evacuate forward dumps while establishing new supply networks supporting defensive operations. The organizational complexity was immense, and failure at any point risked the kind of cascading collapse that could turn withdrawal into disaster. The psychological impact of transitioning from attack to defense, from offensive to survival mode, affected German soldiers across all ranks. Soldiers who'd been told the offensive would break Soviet resistance and restore German momentum now understood they'd spent 8 days achieving nothing except consuming their own combat power. Tank crews who'd survived multiple vehicle breakdowns and combat actions now faced defensive battles, with equipment they knew was worn beyond reliability. Infantry who'd suffered terrible casualties, taking villages like Ponyri, now had to abandon those objectives without the consolation of believing their sacrifice had achieved something meaningful. Model's command approach acknowledged this psychological reality. His orders emphasized survival and cohesion rather than glory or determination. His visits to forward units focused on practical matters, withdrawal routes, defensive positions, supply arrangements, rather than inspirational rhetoric. And he was asking his soldiers to do something psychologically difficult, acknowledge failure, then continue fighting. And he treated them as professionals capable of the difficult task. Soviet perspective on the culmination of German offensive operations mixed celebration and concern. Soviet commanders rightfully celebrated the defensive victory. They'd stopped the German offensive short of all objectives, inflicted heavy casualties, and retained operational reserves for counteroffensive operations. But the cost had been severe. 70,000 casualties in the Central Front alone, over 1,000 tanks lost, defensive positions that would require months to reconstruct. More concerning was the recognition that German tactical proficiency remained high even in defeat. The Ninth Army was withdrawing in good order, maintaining cohesion, not inflicting casualties on Soviet pursuit forces. Soviet commanders had defeated the German offensive, but they hadn't destroyed the German army executing that offensive. The distinction mattered for subsequent operations. By July 13th evening, as the Ninth Army began its withdrawal from the Kursk salient, the battle had reached its culminating point in both operational and symbolic senses. Operationally, German forces had reached the point where continuing attack guaranteed destruction without achieving objectives. Symbolically, the Wehrmacht had launched its last major offensive on the Eastern Front, and had it stopped by an enemy who'd learned to match German operational art with Soviet industrial might. The Eastern War's strategic initiative, the capacity to choose when and where to attack, to set the operational tempo, to force enemies to react, had passed permanently from Germany to the Soviet Union. Hitler, Manstein, and optimistic Wehrmacht planners might not acknowledge this reality for months. Model understood it immediately, and in the battles ahead, the fighting withdrawal from Kursk, the defense of the Hagen Line, the desperate autumn battles to prevent encirclement, Model's realism would be the Ninth Army's salvation, even as it highlighted the larger strategic hopelessness that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The culminating point had arrived. Everything that followed would be rearguard action against inevitable defeat, fought by soldiers who deserved better than the strategic bankruptcy their courage was being asked to redeem. July 15, 1943, evening. Near the village of Olkovatka, Major Heinz Werner's battalion of the 20th Panzer Division forms the 9th Army's rear guard, holding a position blocking the road south from Malor-Kangelsk, while the rest of the division withdraws to positions 10 kilometers north. Werner has 23 tanks operational, a company's strength covering a battalion's frontage. His orders are explicit: hold for 18 hours, then withdraw at night without Soviet detection. Soviet forces probing his positions include elements of 2 rifle divisions and perhaps 60 tanks. Werner understands the mathematics. His battalion is significantly outnumbered, and if Soviet commanders realize how thin his lines are, they'll overrun his position within hours. He's also aware of another calculation. If his battalion holds as ordered, it enables 5 divisions to complete an organized withdrawal to prepared positions. If his battalion fails, those divisions are caught in the open during movement, vulnerable to Soviet attack, potentially facing disaster. The rearguard action that begins as darkness falls on July 15th encapsulates everything that makes Model's withdrawal from Kursk extraordinary. Units accepting terrible risk to enable organizational survival, fighting not for victory, but for time. The concept of fighting withdrawal, organized retreat under pressure, trading space for time while maintaining unit cohesion, is among the most difficult military operations to execute successfully. Offensive operations channel aggression and initiative into forward movement. Defensive operations in place allow preparation and coordination. But withdrawal combines the worst aspects of both. Troops must defend while moving, maintain cohesion while under pressure, preserve equipment while abandoning positions. Military history is filled with fighting withdrawals that became routs, organized retreats that collapsed into mob flight. The margin between successful withdrawal and catastrophic collapse is thin, measured in whether commanders maintain control, whether units trust their officers, and whether soldiers believe their sacrifice serves a purpose beyond delaying their own eventual defeat. Model's withdrawal plan, developed during May and June as part of his contingency preparations, reflected his characteristic thoroughness. He'd divided the 35 to 40 kilometer withdrawal from maximum Kursk penetration to the Hagen Line into 3 phases, or each with designated defensive positions where rearguards could delay Soviet pursuit. Phase 1 positions, established on hills and ridges 3 to 5 kilometers behind maximum penetration, would be occupied from July 13th through July 15th, forcing Soviet forces to mount deliberate attacks before pursuing. Phase 2, positions another 10 to 12 kilometers further back, would be occupied from July 16th through July 19th. Phase 3 would be the Hagen Line itself, prepared fortifications constructed during April and May, designed for sustained defense. Each phase had pre-positioned supply dumps, prepared demolitions on bridges and crossroads, and designated units responsible for rearguard operations. The engineering preparation supporting Model's withdrawal demonstrated why defensive preparation mattered. 5 German engineers had identified 17 critical bridges and 23 crossroads that Soviet forces would need to sustain rapid pursuit. Every bridge had prepared demolition charges, timed to detonate after German forces passed, but before Soviet forces could use them. Every crossroads had identified demolition sites, buildings that could be collapsed to block roads, culverts that could be destroyed to crater highways. On July 17th, German engineers executed these demolitions with precision that bought the 9th Army 36 hours of respite. The Oka River bridges, 5 major spans and a dozen minor ones, were demolished in a carefully sequenced operation that prevented Soviet forces from crossing for nearly 2 full days. Soviet engineers eventually bridged the Oka, but those 2 days allowed German forces to reach Phase 2, positions in organized fashion rather than being caught during movement. Model's personal involvement in the withdrawal was characteristic and operationally essential. On July 20th, as 3 divisions attempted to funnel through a 2-kilometer bottleneck created by terrain and demolished bridges, Model personally directed traffic at the critical crossroads, standing in the open despite Soviet artillery fire, resolving conflicts between units competing for limited road space. His presence, a general feldmarshal directing traffic like a military policeman, had practical effect beyond symbolic value. Officers who might have argued about priority deferred to his authority. Units that might have created congestion followed his directions. In 12 hours, nearly 70,000 men and several hundred vehicles passed through that bottleneck in organized fashion because Model was personally present to ensure organization prevailed over chaos. Rearguard operations during the withdrawal featured tactical innovations that German forces developed specifically for defensive operations on the Eastern Front. Rather than single lines of resistance that Soviet forces could overwhelm, German rearguards employed three-tier systems: outpost lines that detected Soviet approach and fell back after light resistance, main defensive positions held by combined arms teams of infantry, anti-tank guns, and surviving armor, and immediate reserves positioned to counterattack Soviet penetrations or cover withdrawal when positions became untenable. Yet this system forced Soviet pursuit forces to conduct multiple deliberate attacks for each few kilometers of advance, consuming time and inflicting casualties disproportionate to German strength. Soviet after-action reports describe the withdrawal period as costly pursuit operations, where Red Army forces took higher casualties chasing German forces than they'd suffered in the initial defensive battle. The July 21st fighting at Kromi demonstrated rearguard operations at their most effective and most costly. A Kampfgruppe, battle group, built around remnants of the 18th Panzer Division, held defensive positions blocking Soviet advance along the main road to the Hagen Line. The battle group numbered perhaps 1,200 men and 18 operational tanks, a scratch force defending a sector, normally requiring a full division. And Soviet forces attacking this position included elements of 3 rifle divisions and over 80 tanks. The battle began at 0600 hours and continued for 14 hours. The German force destroyed an estimated 32 Soviet tanks and inflicted hundreds of casualties on Soviet infantry. At 2000 hours, having accomplished their mission of delaying Soviet advance, the German force withdrew under cover of darkness. Soviet forces occupied the abandoned positions at 2200 hours, a 16-hour delay for a position that would have taken perhaps 2 hours to overrun if undefended. That 16-hour delay allowed the rest of 9th Army to complete movement to the Hagen Line, with Soviet forces still kilometers behind. And the equipment preservation during withdrawal exceeded expectations given the mechanical condition of German armor. Model had ordered that every repairable vehicle be withdrawn. Tanks unable to move under their own power would be towed if time permitted, abandoned only as last resort. German tank recovery teams worked under fire throughout the withdrawal, retrieving damaged vehicles, conducting field repairs, and evacuating equipment that would normally be destroyed to prevent capture. Of the approximately 250 tanks operational on July 13th, 215 successfully withdrew to the Hagen Line, an 86% preservation rate, despite continuous combat and movement. By contrast, approximately 90 tanks were abandoned during the withdrawal, mostly vehicles so severely damaged or mechanically unreliable that recovery was impossible. Soviet forces captured or destroyed these abandoned vehicles, but the numbers were significantly lower than Model had anticipated when planning the withdrawal. Soviet pursuit operations during the German withdrawal faced challenges that revealed limits of Soviet operational art in 1943. Soviet rifle divisions, having suffered heavy casualties during the defensive battle, advanced cautiously against German rearguards, conducting deliberate attacks rather than aggressive pursuit. Soviet tank armies, intended to exploit German withdrawal through rapid advance, found themselves constrained by demolished bridges, cratered roads, and fuel supply shortages. Soviet logistics, or stretched across the distances of Operation Kutuzov in the Ural sector, struggled to sustain rapid tempo operations simultaneously in multiple directions. The result was a pursuit that remained tactically aggressive but operationally methodical, applying pressure on German forces without achieving the kind of rapid envelopment that might have trapped portions of the 9th Army before reaching prepared defenses. By July 23rd, when the 9th Army completed its withdrawal to the Hagen Line, Model had executed what military historians would later analyze as one of the war's most successful fighting withdrawals. The Army had withdrawn 35 to 40 kilometers while under attack from multiple directions, disengaging from Soviet forces without allowing disengagement to become rout. Total casualties during the withdrawal, approximately 6,000 killed, wounded, and missing, significant but far lower than would have resulted from fighting in place or from disorganized retreat. Equipment losses, approximately 90 tanks, 250 other vehicles, and 40 artillery pieces, serious but not catastrophic. More importantly, the Ninth Army reached the Hagen Line as an organized force with units intact, command and control functioning, and morale remarkably good given circumstances. Soldiers who had experienced 8 days of failed offensive, followed by 2 weeks of fighting withdrawal, understood. They'd survived through professional military competence, not luck or enemy mercy. The psychological impact of successfully completing the withdrawal without collapsing into rout had effects extending beyond the Ninth Army. Across the Wehrmacht in summer 1943, defensive thinking was gaining acceptance as the offensive possibilities of early war years receded. Models' withdrawal from Kursk provided a template: thorough preparation, phased operations, preservation of unit cohesion, acceptance of terrain loss in exchange for survival of combat power. Other German armies facing similar situations would study Models' methods and attempt similar operations with varying success. The operational art of defensive warfare, once considered a specialty for unique situations, was becoming the Wehrmacht's primary operational mode. Mace and Model was demonstrating that excellence in defensive operations required as much skill, preparation, and professional competence as offensive operations had in the war's earlier years. Soviet after-action analysis of the German withdrawal mixed frustration and respect. Soviet commanders recognized they'd allowed a German army to escape what could have been an encirclement and destruction operation, the cautious pursuit, the failure to achieve rapid envelopment, the inability to trap German forces during movement. These were operational shortcomings that Soviet doctrine sought to avoid. Yet Soviet analysts also acknowledged the quality of German defensive operations: the detailed preparation, the effective rearguard actions, the preservation of equipment, the maintenance of cohesion under pressure. These demonstrated that the Wehrmacht, and even in retreat, remained a formidable force requiring respect and caution. The recognition that defeating German offensives didn't automatically enable destruction of German armies would shape Soviet operational planning for the remainder of the war. Model's retrograde masterpiece, the term appears in post-war military analysis by both German and Allied historians, represented the intersection of two trajectories. German operational capability was declining as resources became scarce, replacements inadequate, and strategic position hopeless. But German tactical and operational skill remained high, perhaps even improving as defensive operations received the attention and preparation previously reserved for offensives. Model's withdrawal demonstrated that Germany could still execute complex military operations at high professional standards. Or it also demonstrated that those skills, however professionally executed, were being applied to increasingly futile strategic situations. The Ninth Army had survived, but survival only meant it would fight again in circumstances even less favorable. The retrograde masterpiece saved a German army in July, so that army could be destroyed defending Berlin in April 1945. Tactical excellence was becoming a method of delaying rather than preventing inevitable strategic defeat. July 12, 1943, 0630 hours. 100 kilometers north of the Kursk salient, Soviet Lieutenant General Vasily Sokolovsky's Western Front launches Operation Kutuzov with an artillery preparation that soldiers on both sides will remember as perhaps the most intense bombardment of the entire war. At 3,000 artillery pieces and mortars begin firing simultaneously against German defensive positions on the northern shoulder of the Ural salient. The sound is overwhelming, a continuous roar that makes speech impossible, that creates pressure waves felt in the chest, that announces to every soldier on the Eastern Front that the war's momentum has permanently shifted. German defenders, many of them support troops in security formations rather than frontline combat units, experience what Soviet defenders around Kursk experienced 8 days earlier: the sensation that the earth itself is trying to kill them, that survival is random, that courage and skill matter less than whether the next shell lands 3 meters left or 3 meters right. by 0800 hours, and Soviet rifle divisions are advancing through shattered German defensive positions, encountering scattered resistance but achieving penetrations that within days will threaten the entire Ural salient. Operation Kutuzov represented Soviet operational art at a level of sophistication the Red Army hadn't displayed consistently in previous years of the war. The operation wasn't designed primarily to recapture territory, though territorial gains would be substantial, but to destroy German forces through encirclement and attrition. Soviet planners had studied the Ural salient's geography and identified its fundamental vulnerability. German forces occupied a bulge extending 70 to 80 kilometers east of the main German line, defended on narrow shoulders that Soviet forces could attack from 3 sides simultaneously. Or if Soviet forces could break through the northern and southern shoulders, they could potentially trap multiple German armies in a pocket that would make Stalingrad look modest by comparison. The plan was operationally ambitious and logistically demanding, requiring coordination of 3 Soviet fronts comprising 9 armies, but the potential payoff justified the complexity. The scale of forces committed to Kutuzov demonstrated Soviet industrial capacity and replacement capability that Germany simply couldn't match. The Western, Bryansk, and Central fronts committed to the operation comprised approximately 1.2 million men, 2,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 26,000 artillery pieces and mortars. These weren't forces scraped together from depleted reserves. They were fresh armies that hadn't participated in the defensive battle at Kursk, divisions at full or near full strength, equipped with new tanks and fresh artillery. Soviet war production in early 1943 was generating approximately 12,000 tanks annually, over 100,000 artillery pieces, and 2 million rifles. The Red Army could sustain operations that consume vehicles and ammunition at rates that would bankrupt German logistics. This industrial advantage, combined with improving Soviet tactical proficiency, created an asymmetry that German tactical skill could no longer overcome. July 26th marked one of Kutuzov's critical moments, the potential encirclement of multiple German divisions near the city of Bolkov. Soviet tank armies, exploiting breakthrough penetrations achieved by rifle divisions, had advanced 40 to 50 kilometers in 2 weeks, threatening to cut the escape routes from the Ural salient. German forces defending Bolkov, elements of several divisions already depleted from the Kursk offensive, faced the prospect of encirclement that every Wehrmacht soldier dreaded after Stalingrad. Model, now responsible for 9th Army operations and increasingly influential in Army Group Center planning, committed his last reserves to hold open the escape corridor. The 12th Panzer Division, perhaps 80 operational tanks, one of the few 9th Army formations that hadn't been ground down in the Kursk fighting, counterattacked Soviet spearheads on July 27th and 28th, inflicting heavy casualties and restoring German defensive lines temporarily. The cost was the 12th Panzer's destruction as an effective combat force, but the price purchased perhaps 48 hours for surrounded divisions to escape encirclement. The fighting for Ural itself, the salient's main city, and a major logistics center demonstrated the war's evolution toward urban combat that neither side wanted but both accepted as inevitable. Soviet 3rd Guards Tank Army began entering Ural's outskirts on July 30th, encountering German security troops, stragglers from combat divisions, and hastily assembled defensive positions. The combat that followed lacked the week-long intensity of Ponyri, but shared its essential character: fighting for individual buildings, tank battles at ranges where armor provided minimal protection, infantry assaults where courage mattered more than tactics. August 1st saw hand-to-hand fighting in Ural's city center as Soviet forces cleared German holdouts building by building. German defenders, understanding that holding Ural was impossible, but that every hour of defense enabled more forces to escape the collapsing salient, fought with determination born of professional commitment rather than optimism about outcome. German evacuation of the Ural salient, completed by August 5th, represented both a strategic defeat and an operational success that partially mitigated that defeat. The Soviets had collapsed the entire salient, forcing German withdrawal of 90 kilometers in depth and eliminating a bulge in the front that had required multiple divisions to defend. Germany lost the city of Orel, a major road and rail center, and suffered approximately 86,000 to 90,000 casualties across all defending formations. Soviet gains were substantial. 150 kilometers of front line shortened Army Group Center's defensive requirements, freed Soviet forces for subsequent operations, and demonstrated that Soviet operational capabilities now matched or exceeded German capabilities in planning and executing large-scale offensive operations. Yet, Soviet commanders also recognized a significant failure. They hadn't trapped and destroyed Army Group Center, as their encirclement plans intended. German forces had escaped the potential pocket, maintaining cohesion despite heavy casualties, withdrawing to new defensive lines where they would fight again. As Soviet casualty figures for Operation Kutuzov, approximately 430,000 total casualties including killed, wounded, and missing, were staggering even by Eastern Front standards. These casualties exceeded German losses by roughly 5-1, suggesting that Soviet forces were still suffering heavier attrition than German forces even in victorious operations. But the asymmetry in replacement capacity meant these losses affected Soviet operational capability, less than equivalent German losses would have. Soviet divisions could be rebuilt with fresh conscripts, equipped with newly produced weapons, and returned to combat within weeks. German divisions, once ground down, might receive some replacements but rarely return to full strength. Though the mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side with larger population and greater industrial capacity, and by mid-1943, that advantage decisively favored the Soviet Union. The operational depth of Soviet advances during Kutuzov, 80 to 150 kilometers in different sectors over 3 weeks, demonstrated that Soviet forces had learned to execute the kind of deep operations German forces had pioneered. Soviet tank armies didn't just break through German defenses, they exploited those breakthroughs with rapid advances that threatened German rear areas and created the operational chaos that forced German withdrawals from positions they might otherwise have held. Soviet combined arms coordination, infantry, armor, artillery, and aviation working together, approached the effectiveness German forces had displayed in 1941. Soviet logistics, often considered the Red Army's weakest operational element, sustained offensive operations across distances that strained supply lines but didn't break them. The Red Army of mid-1943 wasn't the disorganized, poorly led force of 1941. It had learned from catastrophic defeats, adapted its doctrine, promoted competent commanders, and developed capabilities that made it the Wehrmacht's operational equal, if not superior. Model's role in stabilizing the German position during Kutuzov's height demonstrated why he'd become Hitler's preferred crisis commander. When sectors of the front began collapsing, Model was the general sent to restore them. His combination of defensive expertise and ruthless decision-making and personal courage made him effective at preventing catastrophic defeats from becoming annihilating disasters. But Model himself understood the limits of his effectiveness. Preventing disaster wasn't the same as achieving victory. Stabilizing collapsing situations didn't change the strategic trajectory. He was, as he'd once described himself to his staff, a fireman, arriving when things were already burning, preventing total destruction, but unable to prevent fires from starting in the first place. And by summer 1943, fires were starting across the entire Eastern Front faster than any number of firemen could contain them. The strategic implications of Kutuzov extended far beyond the Oral salient's collapse. Each Soviet forces had demonstrated capability to conduct simultaneous major operations, defending against German offensive at Kursk while launching their own offensive against the Oral salient. That stretched German operational planning beyond its limits. Soviet operational reserves, rather than being consumed entirely in defensive operations, remained available for subsequent offensive phases. Soviet operational tempo, the ability to sustain continuous operations without pauses for reconstitution, exceeded German tempo, forcing German forces into reactive mode where they responded to Soviet initiatives rather than setting their own operational agenda. The Wehrmacht still fought well tactically, still inflicted heavier casualties than it suffered in many engagements, still executed complex operations with professional competence. But these tactical victories were occurring within an operational framework increasingly controlled by Soviet planning and timing. The partisan warfare that accompanied Kutuzov added another dimension to German difficulties. Soviet partisan units operating in German rear areas conducted coordinated operations, timed to coincide with Red Army advances. Rail lines were sabotaged, supply convoys ambushed, communication networks disrupted. German security forces, already stretched thin defending rear areas, found themselves fighting a two-front war against Soviet regular forces advancing from the east and partisan forces infiltrating from forests and villages. The psychological effect on German troops was corrosive. Nowhere was safe. Every mission beyond front lines was dangerous. And supply networks that sustained combat operations were under constant attack. Model had anticipated this problem and had established dispersed supply networks specifically to reduce vulnerability to partisan interdiction. His preparations mitigated but couldn't eliminate the problem. By August 5th, as German forces completed their withdrawal from the Oral salient and established new defensive positions, the Eastern Front's geography had changed fundamentally. The Germans had lost territory extending over 100 kilometers in depth, across a frontage of 200 kilometers. More importantly, they'd lost the strategic initiative permanently. The Wehrmacht would launch local counterattacks and tactical offensives subsequently, but it would never again conduct strategic offensives on the Eastern Front. And every subsequent operation would be defensive, reactive, attempting to delay Soviet advances rather than achieving German objectives. The psychological impact of this shift affected German planning, soldier morale, and leadership decision-making across all levels. An army that had defined itself through aggressive offensive action for 4 years now had to reconceptualize itself as a defensive force fighting for survival rather than victory. Kutuzov's hammer had fallen with force that shattered German positions and illusions simultaneously. The operational victory was substantial, the casualties inflicted severe, and the territorial gains significant. But perhaps most important was what Kutuzov demonstrated about the war's evolution. The Soviets had matched German operational art, surpassed German logistical capacity, and demonstrated ability to conduct the kind of large-scale offensive operations that Germany could no longer sustain. The Eastern Front remained violent and uncertain. German forces would fight for another 22 months before final defeat. But the trajectory was established. Model understood this, even if he couldn't say it publicly. His army had survived Operation Citadel and Operation Kutuzov through skill and preparation. But survival only enabled continued fighting in circumstances that became progressively worse, against an enemy growing progressively stronger, in service of strategic goals that were already unachievable. The hammer had fallen, and everything that followed would be efforts to survive its impact. August 10th, 1943. In his temporary headquarters in a forest clearing 30 kilometers west of the Hagen Line, General Feldmarschall Walter Model signs the final casualty report for Operation Citadel and submits it to Army Group Center for transmission to the Wehrmacht High Command. The document is clinical, precise, and devastating. Total 9th Army casualties, 23,400 men, killed, wounded, and missing over the period July 5th through August 5th. Tank losses, 400 vehicles total. 200 destroyed beyond recovery. 200 damaged but theoretically repairable if parts and time were available. Artillery losses, 87 tubes destroyed or abandoned. The report includes a single-paragraph assessment that Model knows will infuriate Hitler, but that operational honesty requires: 9th Army offensive objectives not achieved. Enemy defensive systems proved more resilient than intelligence estimated. Subsequent defensive operations successful in preserving Army cohesion, but at costs that significantly reduce future offensive capability. That last phrase, reduce future offensive capability, is Model's diplomatic way of stating what everyone from Army commander to rifle squad leader understands. The 9th Army will never attack again at operational scale. Its offensive power has been consumed. What remains is defensive competence and the question of how long that competence can delay inevitable defeat. Soviet casualty figures for the Central Front's defensive operations paint an equally grim picture with opposite strategic implications. Soviet sources acknowledge approximately 33,000 to 40,000 killed and missing, with total casualties including wounded approaching 70,000 for the defensive battle alone. Tank losses exceed 1,100 vehicles, T-34s, KV-1s, and various light tanks destroyed in defensive fighting and counterattacks. The Soviet 79th Rifle Division, which bore the brunt of fighting at Ponyri, ceased to exist as a functional unit, rebuilt subsequently with fresh conscripts, but effectively destroyed in the week-long battle. Yet Soviet operational planning had anticipated these losses and had positioned reserves specifically to absorb them. The Central Front's commander, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, noted in his after-action report, "Casualties were within acceptable parameters for defensive operations against prepared German offensive. Defensive objectives achieved. Operational reserves preserved for subsequent offensive phases." The contrast between Model's pessimism and Rokossovsky's measured satisfaction captured the asymmetry defining the battle. Both sides suffered terribly, but only one side could afford to. The question of who won Kursk generates different answers depending on what metrics matter. By territorial measures, the battle was nearly irrelevant. The Germans gained 12 kilometers, then lost 40 in the withdrawal, resulting in net Soviet territorial gain of 28 kilometers in the 9th Army sector. By casualty exchange ratios, the Germans achieved favorable results, roughly 2.8 Soviet casualties for each German casualty in the 9th Army sector, demonstrating continued German tactical proficiency. By equipment losses, the ratios favored Germany, roughly 2.75 Soviet tanks destroyed for each German tank lost. German tactical performance remained high throughout the battle. Combined arms coordination worked as doctrine prescribed. Leadership at battalion and regimental levels showed flexibility and initiative. Individual German soldiers demonstrated courage and professional competence that their strategic situation didn't deserve. Yet all these tactical victories occurred within a strategic defeat so comprehensive that the tactical achievements became operationally irrelevant. Germany had committed 3 months of armored vehicle production, approximately 3,800 tanks and assault guns, including reserves, to an offensive that achieved none of its objectives. The Wehrmacht had lost the capacity to conduct strategic offensives on the Eastern Front. German armored reserves, carefully husbanded through spring 1943, had been consumed in 8 days of fighting that gained 12 kilometers. Soviet forces, having defeated the German offensive, retained sufficient strength to launch their own offensives that would continue through autumn and winter. The strategic initiative, the capacity to determine when and where major operations occurred, had passed from Germany to the Soviet Union permanently. Model's assessment in his August 10th report was characteristically blunt. The army survived. The offensive failed. Future operations will be defensive in character and decreasing in effectiveness as replacement rates fail to match attrition rates. The archival controversies surrounding Kursk casualty figures reflect both wartime propaganda needs and post-war historiographical debates. Soviet sources during the war minimized Soviet casualties while maximizing claimed German losses, standard practice for all combatant nations. German sources, particularly those compiled after the war by former Wehrmacht officers, sometimes understated German losses while emphasizing Soviet casualties, attempting to salvage some claim of tactical success from strategic defeat. Modern historians, accessing archives from both sides, have established casualty figures with reasonable confidence, but ambiguities remain. What constitutes a casualty? Killed, wounded, requiring evacuation, wounded returning to duty within days. How to count tank losses? Only total write-offs, or also vehicles requiring major repair. These definitional questions mean casualty figures always include uncertainty ranges. What's indisputable is that both sides suffered grievously, and that only one side could replace its losses adequately. July 20th, 1943, location classified. Soviet intelligence officers interrogate a German tank commander captured near Ponyri, a lieutenant from the 9th Panzer Division, whose Panzer IV was disabled by a mine, then captured when the crew couldn't escape before Soviet infantry surrounded the vehicle. The interrogation report, preserved in Soviet military archives, reveals the psychological state of German soldiers by the offensive's second week. The lieutenant acknowledged that everyone in the company knew the attack wasn't working by July 8th, but that orders were to continue, so we continued. He described the escalating tension between what soldiers saw, Soviet defenses that weren't collapsing, German casualties that weren't sustainable, and what they were told by higher command about imminent breakthrough. The cognitive dissonance between lived reality and official narrative created cynicism that, according to the lieutenant, it was more dangerous to morale than Soviet shells. This psychological dimension of the battle, the gap between what German soldiers experienced and what German leadership acknowledged, receives less attention than casualty statistics but mattered profoundly for subsequent operations. The physical ruins left by the battle created landscapes so thoroughly devastated that post-war reconstruction sometimes simply avoided them. The village of Ponyri, fought over for 7 days, was essentially erased. Reconnaissance photographs from August show rubble rather than buildings, craters rather than streets, burned vehicle hulks rather than any structure larger than debris. Soviet authorities eventually built a new settlement, 2 kilometers from the original site, rather than attempt reconstruction of the ruins. Similar devastation marked dozens of villages and towns across the Kursk battlefield. The field south of Maloarkhangelsk, where German armor attempted to break through Soviet minefields, contained so many unexploded munitions that they remained dangerous for decades. Soviet mine-clearing teams working through 1944 and 1945 removed hundreds of thousands of mines, but estimates suggest tens of thousands remained buried. Farmers working those fields 70 years later still occasionally unearth rusted munitions, and signs warning of unexploded ordnance remain posted in areas where fighting was heaviest. The technological lessons from Kursk influenced both German and Soviet weapons development for the remainder of the war, and Germany learned, or should have learned, that mechanical reliability mattered more than technical sophistication, though institutional momentum toward complex weapons continued. The Elephant's failure led to modifications, including machine gun installation, but the broader lesson about designing weapons for actual combat conditions rather than theoretical superiority was imperfectly absorbed. Soviet forces learned that defensive depth and prepared positions could blunt German attacks even when tactical surprise was impossible. They also learned that their own tank designs, particularly the T-34, were adequate for the war's requirements. Soviet doctrine would emphasize mass production of proven designs over development of technically superior but less reliable alternatives. This philosophical difference, German pursuit of quality, if Soviet acceptance of adequate quantity would characterize armored warfare for the war's remainder. The strategic cost of Kursk extended beyond the immediate battle to Germany's overall position in the war. The offensive consumed resources that weren't available for other theaters. The 3 months delay between initial planning and execution, March through July, gave the Western Allies time to invade Sicily and threaten southern Europe. Hitler used the Allied invasion of Sicily on July 10th as partial justification for ending Citadel, claiming forces were needed in Italy. But the invasion wouldn't have mattered if Citadel had been winning. Hitler ended the offensive because it was failing, and Italy provided a face-saving excuse. The resource commitment to Kursk also affected Germany's ability to respond to subsequent Soviet offensives. As divisions ground down at Kursk needed months to reconstitute, months during which other sectors of the Eastern Front faced Soviet attacks with inadequate reserves. The psychological impact on German leadership, particularly Hitler, manifested in increasingly irrational strategic decision-making. Hitler had invested enormous prestige in Citadel's success, personally delaying the offensive repeatedly to allow more preparation, more new weapons, more favorable conditions. The offensive's failure undermined his confidence in the Wehrmacht's offensive capabilities and in his own strategic judgment. Subsequent decisions, refusal to authorize withdrawals, insistence on holding untenable positions, all commitment of reserves to secondary theaters, reflected a leader who'd lost faith in his military's ability to achieve victory, but refused to acknowledge that losing faith meant accepting defeat. Model, and other realist commanders found themselves navigating between strategic hopelessness and a supreme commander who demanded optimism and punished pessimism. September 1973, Moscow. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, retired in his 80s, participates in a Soviet documentary about the Battle of Kursk. He describes the defensive preparations, the intelligence that warned of German intentions, the fierce fighting at Ponyri and across the defensive zones. When asked about German performance, he pauses before answering carefully. The German soldier remained a formidable opponent even in 1943. And their tactical skill was high, their courage undeniable, their leadership at small unit levels excellent. But courage and skill could not overcome the strategic reality that by 1943, the correlation of forces favored the Soviet Union in all measures that mattered for operational success. That phrase, correlation of forces, was Soviet military theory's way of acknowledging that industrial capacity, population, replacement capability, and logistical sustainment ultimately mattered more than tactical proficiency. Rokossovsky's assessment, delivered 3 decades after the battle, captured what contemporaries on both sides understood but expressed differently. Germany was losing a war that tactical victories couldn't reverse. 1994, Germany. A reunion of Ninth Army veterans. The men now in their 70s and 80s, many of them conscripts in 1943, who'd survived Kursk and subsequent battles. A journalist asks them about the battle's significance. One former infantry sergeant responds, "We knew by the second day that the offensive had failed. We continued because those were our orders and because we trusted our officers and each other. We didn't believe anymore that Germany would win the war. We believed we could survive the war if we fought professionally and watched out for each other. At Kursk, we learned the difference between fighting for victory and fighting for survival. Everything that came after was survival. The distinction between fighting for war-winning objectives and fighting to delay defeat defined German soldiers' experience for the war's remainder. Kursk was the point where most German soldiers understood that distinction, even if they couldn't articulate it while the battle continued. 2020, near Ponyri, Russia. Archaeological teams excavating mass graves continue to find remains of soldiers from both armies, typically identified only by uniform buttons, dog tags when they exist, or forensic analysis. A joint Russian-German commission works to identify remains and return them to families when possible. The excavations reveal details that casualty reports couldn't capture. The youth of many soldiers, analysis of skeletal remains shows numerous individuals under 20 years old. The violence of combat deaths, trauma to skeletal remains consistent with artillery, gunshot wounds, blast injuries. The haste of battlefield burials, mass graves where dozens of bodies were interred rapidly with minimal ceremony. These archaeological finds humanize statistics, transforming numbers and casualty reports into individual human beings who died in causes that most didn't fully understand, in service of strategic objectives that couldn't be achieved, in battles whose necessity their survival couldn't prove. The ruins that matter most aren't physical, but strategic. Kursk ruined Germany's offensive capability on the Eastern Front permanently. It ruined the illusion that tactical excellence could overcome strategic insufficiency. It ruined Hitler's confidence in the Wehrmacht's ability to reverse the war's trajectory through decisive operations. It ruined German soldiers' faith that their sacrifices served achievable objectives rather than simply delaying inevitable defeat. These ruins of capability, illusion, confidence, and faith mattered more than the physical ruins of villages and vehicles scattered across the Kursk battlefield. Model's Ninth Army had survived the battle, but survival within strategic defeat is itself a form of ruin. The army that withdrew to the Hagen Line in July 1943 would fight for 22 more months, but it would fight as an instrument of delay rather than decision, conducting defensive operations that traded time and lives for an outcome that couldn't be prevented, only postponed. Counting the ruins meant counting not just casualties and destroyed equipment, but also the wreckage of strategic possibilities that Kursk had eliminated. The numbers told competing stories, but all the stories ended the same way. With Germany losing and Soviet victory inevitable, the only question remaining was how long the losing would take and how many more would die while the inevitable became actual. August 8, 1943, 0600 hours. Soviet Lieutenant General Ivan Bagramyan's 11th Army begins its assault on German defensive positions along the Hagen Line near the town of Karachev, 60 kilometers west of the Oral Salient's former front. Bagramyan has spent 3 days preparing this attack, concentrating artillery, positioning rifle divisions, organizing supply networks to sustain operations beyond the initial breakthrough. His intelligence officers have briefed him on German defensive preparations, and noting that the positions appear to have been constructed months earlier and are more formidable than typical hastily prepared field works. What Soviet intelligence hasn't fully grasped is that these positions, the Hagen Line, represent Model's contingency planning at its most thorough. The defensive system Bagramyan's troops are about to assault was designed and built in April and May, while Model was simultaneously planning the Citadel offensive. The trenches his soldiers will attack were registered by German artillery in June. The fields of fire his infantry will cross were calculated by German machine gunners in early July. Model built these positions expecting to need them, and now, barely 3 weeks after the offensive began, his pessimism has been vindicated. Here, the Hagen Line is about to demonstrate that Germany could still defend successfully, even though it could no longer attack effectively. The Hagen Line's construction specifications reflected Model's obsession with defensive preparation and his understanding of what was required to stop Soviet attacks. The primary defensive belts consisted of 3 trench lines, each approximately 1.5 meters deep and 1 meter wide, connected by communication trenches that allowed movement between positions under cover. Anti-tank ditches, excavated obstacles 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, channeled Soviet armor into pre-registered killing zones. Bunkers constructed with overhead cover could survive anything except direct hits from heavy artillery. Machine gun positions were sited in depth with interlocking fields of fire, a design so that suppressing one position didn't eliminate covering fire for the sector. The defensive system extended 8 kilometers in depth, meaning Soviet forces would have to conduct multiple breakthrough operations to fully penetrate German defensive zones. Comparing the Hagen Line to earlier German defensive positions on the Eastern Front reveals the evolution of German defensive doctrine, from linear defenses designed to hold ground to zoned defenses designed to survive and attrite attacking forces. The defensive density model had established at critical sectors exceeded anything Soviet attackers had encountered earlier in the war. Near Karachev, where Soviet intelligence had identified the 11th Army's main effort, its model had positioned 25 anti-tank guns per kilometer of front, 5 times the density of typical defensive positions. Artillery batteries were positioned in depth, with pre-registered defensive fires covering every likely Soviet approach route. Infantry strongpoints were organized for all-around defense, capable of continuing resistance even if bypassed or surrounded. German defensive doctrine had evolved to accept that Soviet forces would achieve local penetrations. The goal wasn't to prevent breakthrough, but to contain breakthroughs, counterattack them with local reserves, and inflict such heavy casualties that Soviet operational tempo slowed to manageable rates. August 8th's initial Soviet assault demonstrated both the effectiveness of German defensive preparation and the costs of that effectiveness. Soviet rifle divisions, each attacking after a 90-minute artillery preparation, advanced into German defensive zones and immediately encountered resistance more intense than anticipated. Machine gun fire from concealed positions decimated Soviet assault waves. Anti-tank guns engaged Soviet armor from ranges and angles that suggested every position had been pre-planned. Soviet forces advancing 2 kilometers found themselves under fire from German positions that appeared to materialize from nowhere. Hidden bunkers with camouflaged firing ports, spider holes where single soldiers with machine guns could engage then withdraw through tunnels. By noon, the 11th Army had penetrated perhaps 3 kilometers at maximum advance, but had suffered approximately 3,000 casualties doing so. Yet this wasn't the breakthrough that Soviet operational planning required. It was attritional grinding that favored the defender. Model's defensive system included a mobile reserve component that distinguished his approach from more static defensive doctrines. Rather than positioning all forces in forward defensive positions, Model maintained battalion and company-sized reserves positioned to counterattack Soviet penetrations before they could be exploited. These reserves weren't positioned to recapture lost ground. Model accepted that terrain lost in defensive fighting might not be recoverable. The reserves existed to disrupt Soviet operational tempo, to force Soviet forces to deploy from march column into combat formation repeatedly, to inflict casualties that made Soviet advances expensive regardless of their tactical success. As a German battalion commander described the reserve employment doctrine, "We don't counterattack to restore the position. We counterattack to destroy the enemy's will to continue advancing, make every kilometer cost enough that he questions whether the advance is worth it." August 15th brought an escalation of Soviet efforts to penetrate the Hagen Line. Soviet forces, frustrated by 2 weeks of limited gains at high cost, committed fresh divisions and increased artillery support. The assault began at 0500 hours with a 2-hour artillery preparation, approximately 15,000 shells delivered against a 10-kilometer sector. German positions, constructed to withstand bombardment, survived with degraded effectiveness. Some bunkers collapsed, some trench lines destroyed, and some firing positions eliminated. But the defensive system remained functional. When Soviet infantry and armor advanced at 0700 hours, they encountered defensive fires perhaps 70% as intense as before the bombardment. German doctrine emphasized redundancy, multiple positions covering the same terrain, alternate positions prepared for every primary position, expecting that Soviet artillery would destroy some positions, but that enough would survive to maintain defensive integrity. Soviet tank losses attacking the Hagen Line approached rates that concerned even Soviet commanders accustomed to accepting heavy attrition. The 16th Tank Corps, attacking near Kromy on August 16th, lost 47 tanks in a single day's operations, roughly 1/3 of its engaged strength. Most losses weren't from German tanks, which were relatively scarce in defensive positions, but from anti-tank guns firing from concealed positions at ranges where Soviet tank crews couldn't identify targets before being hit. Soviet doctrine emphasized offensive action and momentum, but momentum into prepared defensive positions generated casualties that Soviet operational planning hadn't fully anticipated. The correlation between Soviet success, measured in kilometers advanced, and Soviet costs, measured in casualties and destroyed equipment, was unfavorable enough that Soviet commanders began modifying their tactics, adopting more deliberate approaches that reduced casualties but also reduced operational tempo. Model's visit to forward defensive positions on August 17th was both a morale gesture and an operational necessity. Soldiers defending the Hagen Line needed to see their army commander, to understand that their defensive success mattered, to know that their sacrifices were recognized at the highest command levels. But Model also needed to personally assess defensive effectiveness, to identify weaknesses before Soviet forces identified and exploited them, to make adjustments to defensive dispositions based on several days' combat experience. His observations led to immediate modifications, increasing anti-tank gun density in sectors where Soviet armor had achieved penetrations, repositioning machine guns to cover dead spaces Soviet infantry had exploited, adjusting artillery defensive fires based on actual Soviet approach routes rather than predicted routes. The Hagen Line wasn't a static defensive system. It was a learning system that adapted based on combat experience. September 6th marked roughly 25 days of Soviet attacks against the Hagen Line, with results that vindicated Model's defensive philosophy while highlighting its ultimate futility. Soviet forces had achieved penetrations ranging from 8 to 15 kilometers at various points, significant tactical success. But those penetrations had cost the 11th Army approximately 45,000 casualties and over 300 tanks. The cost-exchange ratio, roughly 1.5 German casualties for each Soviet casualty in this phase of operations, favored German defenders significantly. German defensive doctrine was working as designed, inflicting disproportionate casualties while trading space for time. The yet working as designed occurred within a strategic context, where space and time were finite resources. Model's defenses could inflict heavy Soviet casualties, but they couldn't destroy Soviet operational capability. The Soviets could sustain 45,000 casualties in one army and replace them. Germany couldn't sustain equivalent losses across its entire Eastern Front without operational collapse. The psychological effect on German defenders of successfully stopping Soviet attacks shouldn't be underestimated. Soldiers who'd experienced the Citadel offensive's failure, who'd conducted a fighting withdrawal under pressure, who'd seen German offensive power consumed to no purpose, now witnessed defensive success. Soviet attacks were stopped. Soviet casualties exceeded German casualties. German professional competence, that's when applied to defensive operations with proper preparation, still generated tactical success. This mattered for morale and unit cohesion. Soldiers who believe their actions achieve tactical objectives fight more effectively than soldiers who believe their sacrifices serve no purpose. The Hagen Line gave German soldiers evidence that professional military competence still mattered, even if larger strategic questions suggested that tactical success might not matter enough. Soviet after-action analysis of operations against the Hagen Line reflected a grudging respect for German defensive proficiency, combined with recognition that defensive success didn't equal strategic victory. Its Soviet operational reports acknowledged that German defensive preparations were thorough and effective, that defensive fires were well coordinated, and that counterattack operations were conducted with typical German tactical skill. But Soviet analysts also noted that German defensive positions, however well prepared, were being slowly reduced through sustained pressure, that German casualty rates in defensive operations were unsustainable given limited replacement capacity, and that Soviet operational reserves could sustain offensive operations far longer than German reserves could sustain defensive ones. The long-term trajectory favored Soviet offense over German defense, even when individual engagements favored German defenders tactically. And the resources required to defend the Hagen Line successfully illuminated Germany's strategic dilemma. Model had positioned approximately 8 divisions along 80 kilometers of front, 1 division per 10 kilometers, roughly double the density typical for defensive operations. Artillery ammunition consumption ran approximately 1,500 tons per day during periods of active Soviet assault, rates that German logistics struggled to sustain. Personnel casualties, though favorable compared to Soviet losses, still averaged 200 to 400 per day across the defensive sector, rates that would deplete divisions within months if sustained. Germany was defending successfully, but couldn't defend everywhere with the intensity model brought to the Hagen Line. Other sectors had lower defensive densities, less thorough preparations, and fewer reserves. Soviet forces, attacking across the entire Eastern Front, would find those weaker sectors and exploit them. Model's defensive success at the Hagen Line was real, but locally limited. It couldn't be replicated across the entire front. Late September brought the inevitable erosion even successful defenses experience. German divisions defending the Hagen Line had been in continuous combat since early August. Personnel were exhausted, equipment was wearing out, and replacement rates weren't matching attrition rates. Soviet forces, continuously reinforced with fresh divisions, maintained pressure that German defenders couldn't match indefinitely. By October 1st, and German defensive positions that had held through August and September began giving way not to dramatic Soviet breakthroughs, but to gradual erosion. A kilometer lost here, 2 kilometers there, positions abandoned because they became untenable rather than because they were stormed. Model, monitoring the defensive situation, recognized the pattern from earlier defensive battles. Successful defense that slowly transformed into managed retreat, tactical victories accumulating into operational withdrawal. The Hagen Line had bought time, approximately 6 weeks during which Soviet advances were limited and costly. But time purchased is eventually spent, and by early October, Model was planning the next phase of withdrawal to defensive positions further west. In the Hagen Line's ultimate significance lay not in its tactical success, but in what that success revealed about the war's trajectory. Germany could still defend successfully when properly prepared, properly resourced, and properly commanded. German soldiers remained professionally competent. German tactical doctrine remained effective, and German defensive engineering remained among the war's best. But these attributes, impressive as they were, operated within strategic constraints that made even successful defense a form of slow defeat. Every day of successful defense was a day closer to eventual offensive collapse somewhere else on the front. Every casualty inflicted on Soviet forces was replaced while German casualties diminished irreplaceable strength. Every kilometer of ground traded for time was ground that would never be recovered. The model's defensive masterpiece at the Hagen Line was a triumph of operational art applied to strategic futility, proof that Germany could still fight brilliantly even as the war's outcome became inescapable. The line had held, the enemy had bled, and none of it changed the fundamental reality that tactical excellence was delaying rather than preventing strategic catastrophe. May 1943, Berlin. At the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer reviews production schedules with his senior staff, calculating what Operation Citadel will require and what it will cost in terms of foregone production. The meeting's minutes, preserved in German archives, reveal calculations that should have raised alarm bells at the highest command levels. Any Speer's analysts estimate that Citadel will require approximately 3,800 tanks and assault guns, including operational reserves. Essentially 3 months of German armored vehicle production committed to a single offensive. The plan is to begin the offensive in May, achieve breakthrough by early June, and return forces to other theaters by July. But Speer's staff notes a complicating factor. If the offensive is delayed for any reason, mechanical problems, weather, strategic considerations, the opportunity costs escalate dramatically. Every month of delay means another month of production consumed by the offensive rather than distributed to other theaters. Speer's recommendation to the meeting: execute Citadel immediately or cancel it entirely. Delay transforms expensive into catastrophic. His recommendation would be ignored. The offensive would be delayed repeatedly, and the catastrophic production consequences he predicted would manifest exactly as his analysts calculated. The resource allocation to Citadel reflected Hitler's fixation on the offensive's supposed war-changing potential. German tank production in early 1943 averaged approximately 400 vehicles monthly, a remarkable achievement given Allied bombing and resource constraints, but still inadequate for Germany's multi-front requirements. Normal distribution would allocate roughly 40% to the Eastern Front, 30% to reserves and training, 20% to other theaters, and 10% to replacement of obsolescent vehicles. Citadel disrupted this distribution entirely. From March through July, approximately 70% of production went to building up forces for Kursk, with only 30% available for all other requirements. This meant the Mediterranean theater received minimal armored reinforcement during precisely the period when Allied invasion of Sicily became likely. It meant defensive forces on other Eastern Front sectors operated with depleted armor. Most importantly, it meant that when Citadel failed, there were no reserves available to mitigate that failure. The emergency production orders issued during Citadel created cascading failures in Germany's industrial planning. When Model requested additional Panthers in June, production facilities already operating at maximum capacity diverted resources from other programs. Steel allocated for tank destroyer production went to tank production instead. Machine tools scheduled for maintenance were kept operating despite accelerating wear. Labor forces already working, extended shifts were pushed to even longer hours, reducing efficiency and increasing errors. The immediate result was a short-term increase in tank output. The medium-term result was production facility degradation that would take months to recover. Speer's post-war memoir notes with bitter precision: we borrowed production capacity from August through December to sustain Citadel in July. When Citadel failed, we had neither the tanks we'd built for the offensive nor the tanks we should have been building for defensive operations afterward. July through December, 1943's production figures revealed Citadel's true cost. In German tank and assault gun production during this period totaled approximately 4,200 vehicles against planned production of 5,100, a shortfall of 900 vehicles. The shortfall had multiple causes: production facilities degraded by emergency operations during Citadel preparation, labor exhaustion reducing efficiency, Allied bombing, increasingly targeting tank production facilities, and resource allocation disruptions that hadn't fully recovered from Citadel's demands. Meanwhile, Soviet production during the same period exceeded 12,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The arithmetic was brutal. Germany's production advantage from earlier war years had vanished. Soviet quantitative superiority was growing, and German industrial capacity was declining while Soviet capacity increased. Citadel had consumed German production capacity at precisely the moment when conservation would have been strategically prudent. August 1943, Nuremberg. At the Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, MAN factory producing Panther tanks, senior production manager Hans Ostermann reviews a quality control report that terrifies him. Panthers produced during June and July, when the factory was operating under maximum pressure to deliver vehicles for Citadel, are experiencing failure rates 30% higher than Panthers produced in May. Transmission failures, engine fires, track breakages, the emergency production conditions resulted in quality control compromises that are now manifesting as mechanical unreliability. Ostermann's report to the Reich Ministry notes, "We delivered the quantities requested for Operation Citadel. We did not deliver the quality required for sustained combat operations. The factory requires at least 8 weeks of normal operations to restore quality standards. 8 weeks of normal production at reduced output, precisely what Germany's strategic situation couldn't afford, but what industrial reality required. The replacement gap, the difference between what Germany needed to replace combat losses and what production could deliver, widened catastrophically in the months following Kursk. Model's 9th Army alone lost 400 tanks during Citadel and subsequent defensive operations. Manstein's forces in the southern Citadel pincer lost similar numbers. Other Eastern Front sectors, facing Soviet offensives throughout summer and autumn, lost additional hundreds. Total German tank losses on the Eastern Front from July through December. 1943 approached 2,000 vehicles. Production during the same period delivered approximately 4,200 vehicles, but only roughly 2,500 went to the Eastern Front, after accounting for other theater requirements, training needs, and vehicles held in strategic reserve. The mathematics suggested Germany was barely replacing Eastern Front losses, until you factored in mechanical attrition, which consumed approximately 25% of deployed vehicles regardless of combat action. Include mechanical losses, and Germany was losing the Eastern Front tank war by attrition even without major defeats. Soviet production advantages extended beyond simple quantity to operational sustainability. The T-34, all while technically inferior to late-model German tanks in several parameters, possessed mechanical reliability that made it operationally superior. A T-34 that was 90% as effective as a Panther, but was operational 95% of the time, was more valuable than a Panther, operational only 60% of the time. Soviet production doctrine emphasized adequate sufficiency and mechanical simplicity over technical excellence and sophisticated complexity. This meant Soviet armored forces could sustain higher operational tempos because their vehicles broke down less frequently, were easier to repair when they did break down, and were replaced more quickly when they were destroyed. German forces achieved higher kill ratios in tank versus tank combat, but couldn't translate that tactical advantage into operational effectiveness because mechanical unreliability offset combat superiority. The strategic resource allocation to Citadel also affected Germany's capacity to respond to threats in other theaters. The July 10th Allied invasion of Sicily caught German forces in the Mediterranean with minimal armored reserves because most armor production had gone to the Eastern Front for Citadel. When Hitler cited the Sicily invasion as justification for ending Citadel, he was partially responding to a crisis his own resource allocation decisions had created. If German armor production had been distributed normally rather than concentrated for Citadel, more forces would have been available in Italy. The Sicily crisis was partially caused by Citadel, then used to justify ending Citadel, a circular logic that revealed the cognitive dissonance at the highest levels of German strategic planning. The psychological impact on German tankers of operating increasingly unreliable equipment while facing increasingly numerous Soviet tanks, cannot be quantified, but mattered profoundly. Tank crews who'd begun the war with confidence in their technical superiority now found themselves in vehicles that might break down before they reached combat, facing enemies who could afford to lose tanks at rates Germany couldn't match, operating in an environment where mechanical failures were as dangerous as enemy action. A Panzer IV commander in the 4th Panzer Division, writing to his family in October 1943, it captured this psychology. "Our tank is a good machine, but Ivan has 10 machines for each of ours, and 9 of his work while 3 of ours don't. We're still better soldiers, I think, but I'm not sure that matters anymore." That erosion of confidence, not in individual skill but in systematic advantage, affected combat effectiveness in ways difficult to measure but significant nonetheless. The counterfactual question, what if Germany had distributed Citadel's allocated production normally instead of concentrating it for the offensive, reveals the operation's true cost. 3 months of normal production, properly distributed, would have provided approximately 1,200 tanks to the Eastern Front, 400 to Mediterranean and Western theaters, 400 to strategic reserves, and 800 to replacement of obsolescent vehicles. This distribution wouldn't have prevented eventual German defeat. Soviet advantages in production, manpower, and resources were too substantial. But it might have delayed defeat by months, might have prevented some catastrophic defensive failures, might have allowed more successful evacuation of German forces from subsequently collapsed sectors. Instead, Citadel consumed those resources, achieving objectives that 12-year-old boys studying maps could have predicted were unachievable given Soviet defensive preparations. December 1943. Economic analysis by Speer's ministry calculated Citadel's total economic cost at approximately 15% of Germany's total industrial output for the period March through July, resources diverted from other production, make emergency measures that reduced efficiency and delayed recovery effects. This figure didn't include opportunity costs, what Germany could have produced instead if resources hadn't been allocated to Citadel. Including opportunity costs, the offensive consumed roughly 20% of German industrial capacity for 4 months to achieve zero strategic benefit. Speer's presentation of these figures to Hitler in December 1943 reportedly generated one of the Führer's legendary rages, followed by a demand that Speer never calculate such figures again. The truth of Citadel's cost was too uncomfortable for leadership to acknowledge, so it was classified and buried in archives that wouldn't be opened until Germany had already lost the war. Those costs helped lose. Now, the panzers that never were, the tanks that should have been built in August through December, but weren't because production capacity had been consumed by Citadel, represent one of history's clearest examples of sunk cost fallacy at strategic scale. Germany had invested enormous resources in an offensive that senior commanders privately predicted would fail. When the offensive did fail, rather than acknowledging the sunk costs and cutting losses, Germany continued investing resources in futile attempts to recover something from the failed operation. This pattern, investing in failing operations, refusing to acknowledge failure, consuming additional resources, attempting to salvage unsalvageable situations, characterized German strategic decision-making increasingly as the war progressed. Kursk was the operation where this pattern became undeniable, where the gap between resources invested and results achieved became too large to rationalize through tactical success stories or enemy casualty statistics. The panzers that never were represented not just foregone production, but foregone strategic flexibility, foregone operational options, and ultimately foregone possibility of negotiated settlement or favorable defensive position. Germany had gambled production capacity on strategic success and lost, leaving it poorer in precisely the resource, armored combat power, that its strategic situation most required. The remainder of the war would be fought with that deficit, and no amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for the industrial bankruptcy that Kursk had accelerated. September 7th, 1943. Now, early morning, at 9th Army Headquarters, now located in a bunker complex near Bryansk, Model receives a situation report that confirms his worst fears are materializing faster than even his pessimistic planning anticipated. Soviet forces have achieved a breakthrough penetration 30 kilometers wide between the 9th Army and 4th Army to the south, creating a dangerous gap that threatens to isolate both formations. The Soviet 11th Guards Army is exploiting the breakthrough, advancing westward at speeds approaching 15 kilometers per day. Not the methodical grinding that characterized earlier operations, but operational-level exploitation that threatens encirclement. OA Model's operations officer spreads a map showing the situation with brutal clarity. If Soviet forces continue advancing at current rates for another 48 hours, they'll cut the primary supply routes sustaining the 9th Army. If they advance for 72 hours, they'll be positioned to encircle the entire army in a pocket that could trap over 200,000 German soldiers. Model has faced potential encirclement before, at Rzhov, where he'd held a surrounded position for months. But this situation differs critically. At Rzhev, German forces controlled the interior of the pocket with fortified positions and aerial supply. Here, Soviet forces would control the interior while German forces occupied the vulnerable perimeter. The mathematics of survival have shifted fundamentally. The gap between 9th and 4th Armies wasn't an accident of poor coordination, but an inevitable result of stretched German defensive lines and declining combat power. German doctrine specified that armies should defend with approximately 10 to 12 kilometers of front per division. In the sectors facing the September Soviet offensives, German armies were defending with 15 to 20 kilometers per division, nearly double the doctrinal standard. This wasn't incompetence, but arithmetic. Germany didn't have enough divisions to defend the Eastern Front at proper density. Every kilometer of front required defenders, and every defender had to be sustained with supplies, supported with artillery, and backed with reserves. German logistics could barely sustain current defensive densities. Increasing densities would require resources Germany didn't possess. The result was a defensive line that had minimal depth, no operational reserves, and vulnerabilities that Soviet operational planning specifically targeted. Soviet operational planning for the September offensives demonstrated the Red Army's evolution towards sophisticated multi-echelon operations. Rather than attacking German forces frontally across the entire front, Soviet commanders identified boundary zones between German armies, sectors where command and control was less clear, where responsibility for defense wasn't unambiguously assigned, where German commanders might assume their neighbor was defending ground that nobody was actually defending. The breakthrough between 9th and 4th Armies occurred in precisely such a boundary zone, or where both armies assumed the other had responsibility for defense, but where neither had positioned adequate forces. Soviet reconnaissance had identified this weakness through careful intelligence work, intercepting German radio traffic, interrogating prisoners, analyzing aerial photographs that showed defensive position gaps. The subsequent offensive exploited that weakness with precision that German commanders found both impressive and terrifying. September 12th brought Model's moment of decision, one that would define his relationship with Hitler for the remainder of his career. Hitler's orders were explicit. 9th Army would hold current positions, would not withdraw under any circumstances, and would await relief by counterattack forces being assembled from other sectors. Model's assessment of these orders was equally explicit, and delivered in a telephone conversation with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center. If the 9th Army holds current positions, it will be encircled within 72 hours and destroyed within 2 weeks. I request permission to conduct fighting withdrawal to defensive positions along the Dnieper River. Kluge, himself under strict orders from Hitler to authorize no withdrawals, refused Model's request. Model's response, according to staff officers who overheard the conversation, was characteristic. Then I will interpret my orders in the manner that best preserves the Army's survival. You may tell the Führer that Model is responsible for what follows. He ordered withdrawal to begin that night. The fighting withdrawal from the Desna River positions to the Dnieper, a distance of approximately 50 kilometers, combined every lesson Model had learned in 2 years of defensive warfare. Rear guards established at 5-kilometer intervals would delay Soviet pursuit for 6 to 12 hours each, then withdraw under cover of darkness to the next position. Engineers would demolish every bridge, crater every road, and destroy every supply dump that couldn't be evacuated. Artillery would maintain continuous harassing fire on Soviet approach routes, preventing rapid advance even when defensive positions were abandoned. Infantry would conduct movement primarily at night, reducing vulnerability to Soviet air attack and making Soviet pursuit more difficult to coordinate. The plan required precise timing, disciplined execution, and an acceptance that some units designated as rear guards would suffer disproportionate casualties, buying time for the main body to escape. September 18th marked one of the withdrawal's most desperate phases, the defense of the Yelnya Gap, where German forces had to funnel through a 12-kilometer-wide corridor between Soviet spearheads advancing from north and south. The 18th Panzer Division, reduced to 23 operational tanks after weeks of continuous combat, held defensive positions on the corridor's northern shoulder, engaging Soviet forces attempting to close the gap. For 48 hours, this scratch force fought against odds approaching 10-1, buying time for 5 divisions to pass through the corridor to relative safety. The cost was the 18th Panzer's effective destruction as a combat formation. By September 20th, the division counted 7 operational tanks and fewer than 3,000 effective infantry, roughly 20% of authorized strength. But those 48 hours were the difference between the 9th Army's survival and its encirclement. The human cost of the September withdrawal went beyond casualty statistics to psychological exhaustion that pushed soldiers toward breaking points. German forces had been in continuous combat since early July, first attacking at Kursk, then withdrawing to the Hagen Line, then defending there for 6 weeks, now conducting another fighting withdrawal while facing potential encirclement. Soldiers were operating on minimal sleep, inadequate nutrition, and constant psychological stress. The medical officers reported increasing cases of combat exhaustion, soldiers physically capable of continuing but mentally unable to process orders or respond to situations. This wasn't cowardice. It was neurological shutdown from stress exceeding human capacity to cope. German military medicine in 1943 barely understood combat stress, typically treating it as lack of willpower rather than legitimate medical condition. Soldiers suffering combat exhaustion were often returned to their units with orders to show more determination, a response that revealed institutional ignorance about psychological limits of combat stress. Soviet pursuit operations during the September withdrawal demonstrated both the Red Army's growing operational capability and the limits of that capability when facing a professionally conducted fighting withdrawal. Soviet advance rates, 8 to 12 kilometers per day during the withdrawal period, were respectable, but fell short of the rapid exploitation that Soviet doctrine emphasized. The problem wasn't Soviet tactical incompetence, but the cumulative effect of German delaying actions. Every destroyed bridge cost Soviet engineers hours to bridge. Every German rearguard action cost Soviet assault forces time to deploy and attack. Every mined road section cost Soviet logistics precious time and vehicles. The aggregate effect was that Soviet forces advanced methodically rather than exploitatively, now giving German forces time to conduct organized withdrawal rather than forcing precipitous retreat that could become rote. September the 25, early morning. Advanced elements of the 9th Army reached defensive positions along the Dnieper River's eastern bank, the last prepared defensive line before the river itself. Behind them, scattered rearguard units are still conducting delaying actions, still buying hours with lives, still executing the most difficult mission in warfare, retreat under pressure while maintaining cohesion. Model, arriving at the Dnieper positions to personally inspect defenses, encounters soldiers who've marched 50 kilometers in 2 weeks while fighting continuously. They're exhausted, filthy, hungry, and remarkably still organized as military units. A battalion commander from the 292nd Infantry Division, the same division that fought at Ponyri in July, reports to Model with numbers that tell a story of survival through professionalism. The battalion began July with 840 men, now counts 230 effectives, has conducted 3 major defensive actions and 1 fighting withdrawal in the past 80 days, and is combat capable for defensive operations. Model's response, witnessed by staff officers, was uncharacteristically emotional. "You've done everything asked of you and more. The Army survives because of you." For a commander known for harsh standards and minimal praise, this acknowledgement mattered. The September withdrawal's cumulative costs revealed the arithmetic of attrition that defined the Eastern Front's latter years. The Ninth Army had suffered approximately 12,000 casualties during the withdrawal, killed, wounded, and missing. It had lost approximately 60 additional tanks, mostly to mechanical breakdown or abandonment when recovery proved impossible. It had retreated 250 kilometers from its July 5th start positions, surrendering territory that had taken years to conquer. Yet the Army remained intact as a fighting force, maintaining organizational structure, command and control, and combat capability. By contrast, Soviet forces pursuing the withdrawal had suffered an estimated 18,000 casualties, higher than German losses despite Soviet operational success. The casualty exchange ratio favored Germany tactically, while the territorial exchange favored the Soviet Union operationally. This pattern, German tactical success within Soviet operational success, characterized the entire period from Kursk through the end of 1943. Model's relationship with Hitler after the September withdrawal exemplified the tension between operational necessity and political loyalty that defined Wehrmacht command in the war's latter years. Hitler, upon learning that Model had withdrawn, despite explicit orders to hold positions, summoned Model to East Prussia for a personal meeting. Staff officers expected Model to be relieved of command, possibly court-martialed for insubordination. Instead, Hitler, after a reported 3-hour conversation, confirmed Model in command and authorized his defensive dispositions along the Dnieper. What changed Hitler's mind remains debated, and some historians emphasize Model's personal relationship with Hitler, built through earlier defensive successes. Others note that Army Group Center's situation was so precarious that replacing Model risked complete collapse. Most likely, Hitler recognized what everyone else already knew. Model was the best defensive commander Germany had, and the Eastern Front was now entirely about defense. Ideological purity mattered less than operational competence when facing potential catastrophe. The psychological impact on German soldiers of repeated fighting withdrawals, Kursk to Hagen Line to Desna River to Dnieper, created a sense of inevitable defeat that official propaganda couldn't counter. Soldiers understood the war's trajectory. They were retreating, always retreating, trading ground for time, and fighting brilliantly to delay outcomes they couldn't prevent. Letters home from German soldiers in autumn 1943, intercepted by censors and analyzed by military intelligence, reveal this mindset. A corporal in the 20th Panzer Division wrote, "We win every battle and lose the war 1 kilometer at a time. Our officers tell us the withdrawal is temporary, that we'll counterattack when conditions permit. Nobody believes this. We retreat because we must. We fight well because we're professionals. But we're professionals in a losing cause." Military censors flagged such letters as defeatist, but couldn't prevent the sentiment from spreading. Soviet perspective on the September operations reflected satisfaction with strategic outcomes despite tactical frustrations. Soviet forces had liberated substantial territory. East had inflicted significant German casualties and had pushed German forces progressively westward. But Soviet commanders also recognized they hadn't achieved the decisive encirclement and destruction of German forces that operational planning had aimed for. The Ninth Army had escaped potential encirclement, had maintained cohesion during withdrawal, and had reached new defensive positions still capable of further resistance. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, coordinating Soviet operations across multiple fronts, noted in his memoir, "The Germans were retreating, but not collapsing. Every withdrawal was orderly, every rearguard action was professional, and every new defensive line was properly prepared. We were winning, but the Germans were making us pay for every victory." This recognition that defeating Germany required sustained operations over months and years, not single decisive battles, shaped Soviet operational planning for the war's remainder. By month's end, as September gave way to October, the Ninth Army occupied positions along the Dnieper that were geographically significant but strategically temporary. The Dnieper represented a major river obstacle, defensible terrain that might delay Soviet advance for weeks or months. But everyone from Army commander to rifle squad leader understood these positions were waypoints, not destinations. The war's trajectory was westward, always westward, toward borders and capitals that soldiers had left years earlier, expecting to return as victors. Model, reviewing situation maps in his headquarters bunker, A saw with characteristic clarity what his superiors preferred to ignore. Germany was losing the Eastern Front not through catastrophic defeats but through accumulating withdrawals. Each withdrawal was successful in preserving army cohesion, but each left Germany weaker and the Soviet Union stronger. The precipice September had revealed wasn't a single dramatic cliff, but a gradual slope leading inexorably downward. The Ninth Army had avoided falling off the precipice in September, but the slope continued, and at its bottom lay defeat that skill and courage could delay but couldn't prevent. How many more times could one army escape encirclement through professional competence? How many more withdrawals could maintain cohesion before cohesion became irrelevant? These questions haunted Model as autumn darkened into winter, and for them, he had no answers except to continue doing what he did best, keeping his soldiers alive through one more impossible situation, preparing for the next crisis, fighting brilliantly in service of a cause already lost. 1956, Nuremberg, Germany. In a quiet conference room, Allied prosecutors at the International Military Tribunal examined testimony about General Feldmarschall Walter Model, who had committed suicide in April 1945 rather than surrender to Allied forces. The testimony comes from both Soviet and German witnesses, and it reveals a curious paradox. Model was simultaneously Hitler's most reliable executor of defensive operations and one of the Wehrmacht's most frequent violators of Hitler's hold-at-all-costs orders. A Soviet general testifies that Model's defensive operations at Kursk and subsequently were professionally executed to the highest standards of military art. A German staff officer testifies that Udell Malas interpreted orders in ways that preserved his army even when those interpretations contradicted explicit commands. The prosecutors note Model's suicide prevented his trial, but the testimony suggests a complex figure, neither war criminal nor resistance hero, but a professional soldier executing defensive operations with excellence while serving a criminal regime. The question they cannot resolve is one that troubles historians subsequently. Was Model's defensive brilliance ultimately a service to Nazi Germany, prolonging the war and therefore prolonging the Holocaust and other atrocities? Or was his repeated rescue of encircled German armies a humanitarian act, saving soldiers' lives even if it couldn't save the regime? The answers depend on moral frameworks that military history alone cannot provide. 1965, Moscow. The 20th anniversary of victory over Nazi Germany occasions a reunion of Soviet veterans who fought at Kursk. Marshal Rokossovsky, now in his late 60s, addresses the gathering with reflections on the battle's significance. He describes the defensive preparations, the fierce fighting, the eventual Soviet victory. But when asked about German performance, his response is nuanced. The Germans fought with skill and courage even in defeat. Their soldiers remained formidable opponents throughout the war. Kursk was their last moment of offensive capability. But they continued to defend effectively for 2 more years. We defeated them not because they became incompetent, but because we became stronger, and because the correlation of forces turned decisively in our favor. A Soviet tank commander in the audience, a man who'd fought through Kursk and onward to Berlin, raises a question. If they fought so well, why did they lose? Rokossovsky's answer captures a fundamental truth. They fought excellently at the tactical level, but tactical excellence cannot overcome strategic impossibility. They were outnumbered, outproduced, and fighting a war they couldn't win. Courage and skill delayed their defeat, but couldn't prevent it. 1990, Germany. The reunification of East and West Germany opens archives that provide unprecedented access to Wehrmacht documents. This historians examining Ninth Army records from mid-1943 discover Model's daily situation reports to Army Group Center. These reports reveal that Model understood by mid-July, barely 10 days into Operation Citadel, that the offensive couldn't succeed. A July 14th report states explicitly, "Continued offensive operations will not achieve breakthrough to operational depth. Recommend transition to defensive operations while sufficient combat power remains to conduct effective defense." This report was noted by Army Group Center but not forwarded to Hitler. Model's subsequent reports through July and August consistently emphasized defensive priorities over offensive objectives, revealing a commander who'd mentally transitioned to defensive warfare even while nominally conducting offensive operations. The archival evidence suggests Model's entire approach to Kursk was shaped by his expectation of failure, a self-fulfilling prophecy, his critics would argue, or realistic planning, his defenders respond. The question of whether Kursk was Germany's last victory depends entirely on how victory is defined. By territorial measures, Kursk was a clear defeat. Germany gained minimal ground, then lost substantially more during subsequent Soviet offensives. By casualty exchange ratios, Germany achieved tactical success, inflicting roughly 2.5 to 3 Soviet casualties for each German casualty in the 9th Army sector. By operational objectives, Kursk was a catastrophic failure. None of Germany's objectives were achieved, Soviet offensive capability was not destroyed, and the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Yet in a narrower sense, the 9th Army's performance at Kursk represented a victory of professional military competence over impossible circumstances. The Army attacked skillfully, withdrew successfully, and survived what could have been an encircling disaster. If victory means executing difficult military operations at high professional standards, then Kursk showcased German tactical victory within strategic defeat. 2023 Battlefield Archaeology near Ponyri. Excavation teams continue finding remains of soldiers from both armies, 80 years after the battle. The archaeological work reveals details that written records don't capture. The age of casualties. Skeletal analysis shows many soldiers were teenagers, some barely 18 years old when they died. The violence of combat, trauma patterns on skeletal remains indicate artillery, gunshot wounds, and blast injuries that killed instantly or caused agonizing deaths over hours. The haste of burial, mass graves where dozens were interred with minimal ceremony, suggesting the tactical necessity of rapid burial outweighed any possibility of respectful individual interment. A joint Russian-German commission works to identify remains through DNA analysis when possible, returning them to families or interring them in military cemeteries with appropriate honors. The commission's work humanizes statistics, transforming casualty figures in military reports into individual human beings who died far from home in causes most didn't fully understand. It models fate, suicide in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945 rather than surrender, reflects the tragic arc of German commanders who maintain professional standards while serving a criminal regime. Model never joined the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, never participated in military resistance to the Nazi regime, and continued fighting effectively until Germany's final collapse. His suicide note, discovered after the war, expressed no remorse for serving Hitler, but stated he wouldn't give the Soviets the satisfaction of parading me as a trophy. This formulation reveals Model's psychological framework, loyalty to soldiers and professional military identity, but minimal engagement with the moral questions about the regime he served. Post-war analysis of Model's career generates divided assessments. Some historians emphasize his defensive expertise and his repeated efforts to save soldiers' lives through realistic operational planning. Others note that his competence prolonged Nazi Germany's existence, extending the Holocaust and other atrocities that continued until final defeat. The 9th Army's fate after Kursk followed a predictable trajectory of declining strength and increasing desperation. Rebuilt after September 1943, it fought defensive battles through winter and spring of 1944, was devastated during the Soviet summer offensive Operation Bagration, was rebuilt again, and finally was destroyed in the Battle of Berlin in April 1945. The few soldiers who fought at Kursk survived until war's end. Most became casualties in the defensive battles that consumed German armies progressively from 1943 through 1945. The 21st Panzer Division, the 2nd Panzer Division, the 9th Panzer Division, formations that attacked at Kursk, all continued fighting until destroyed in various battles between Kursk and Berlin. The organizational continuity was nominal. Few actual veterans of Kursk remained in these formations by 1945. Units were repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, retaining names and traditions, but losing the soldiers who'd created those traditions. Soviet strategic results from Kursk extended far beyond the immediate battle. Yet the defensive victory demonstrated that Soviet forces could stop German offensives through preparation and operational depth. The subsequent counteroffensives, Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, demonstrated that Soviet forces could conduct successful offensive operations at operational scale. Together, these operations established a pattern that would continue until war's end. Soviet offensives pushing westward, German defenses delaying but not stopping those offensives, territorial losses mounting, German combat power declining. The chain was unbroken from Kursk in July 1943 through the fall of Berlin in May 1945, 2 years of continuous Soviet operational success, punctuated by occasional German tactical victories that didn't alter the strategic trajectory. The historical consensus on Kursk's significance coalesced over decades of scholarship, accessing archives from both sides. Most historians agree on several key points. Kursk was Germany's last strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. German tactical proficiency remained high throughout the battle, but tactical excellence couldn't overcome Soviet operational depth and industrial superiority. Soviet defensive operations were the most sophisticated defensive preparations of the war to that point. Casualty figures, while debated in specifics, clearly show both sides suffered grievously, with Soviets losing more in absolute terms, but having greater capacity to replace losses. The battle marked a permanent shift in strategic initiative from Germany to the Soviet Union. No serious historian claims Kursk was the war's decisive battle. The war's outcome was determined by multiple factors over years, but most acknowledge it was a decisive battle, marking the point where German defeat on the Eastern Front became inevitable rather than merely probable. The counterfactual questions surrounding Kursk: what if Germany hadn't attacked? What if the attack had begun in May rather than July? What if Model's pessimism had been heated and the operation canceled? Revealed the limited range of plausible alternatives. Not attacking at Kursk would have preserved German armor for defensive operations, but wouldn't have prevented Soviet offensives from beginning elsewhere. Attacking in May might have achieved marginal tactical improvements, but wouldn't have overcome Soviet defensive preparations. Canceling the operation would have freed resources for other uses, but wouldn't have addressed Germany's fundamental strategic problems: declining combat power, inadequate industrial production, fighting on multiple fronts against enemies with greater resources. The counterfactuals suggest that by summer 1943, Germany's strategic position was constrained enough that no single operational decision could significantly alter the war's trajectory. The legacy of Model's defensive operations at Kursk influenced military doctrine in ways that extended beyond the immediate battle. Post-war military analysis by Western armies studied Model's defensive techniques: preparation of positions in depth, acceptance of territorial loss in exchange for enemy attrition, mobile reserves to counterattack penetrations, fighting withdrawal under pressure. These techniques became incorporated into NATO defensive doctrine during the Cold War, reflecting recognition that Model's methods represented defensive warfare at its most professionally effective. Soviet analysis also studied Model's techniques, seeking to develop offensive methods that could overcome such defenses. The irony is that Model's most significant contribution to military art came in defeat, teaching defensive lessons that armies would study for generations, even as his own army was destroyed, attempting to implement those lessons against an enemy with overwhelming advantages. Modern-day Kursk, Russia. The battlefield has been absorbed into agricultural land, forests, and small towns. Memorials dot the landscape, Soviet memorials primarily, commemorating Soviet victory and sacrifice. And German soldiers who died at Kursk are buried in military cemeteries or remain in mass graves, marked and unmarked. A Russian farmer working land near Olkhovatka occasionally finds battlefield debris, rusted shell fragments, pieces of vehicles, personal items from soldiers long dead. When asked about the battle's significance, he offers perspective shaped by living on land, saturated with the past. Here, They came with thousands of tanks. We stopped them. It was the beginning of the end. His grandson, listening, asks, "Which side's end?" The farmer's response captures the battle's essential truth. Everyone's. The Germans ended their ability to win. We ended our time of losing. Both sides ended something, but only we survived the ending. The final accounting of Kursk transcends casualty statistics and territorial exchanges. German tactical excellence, demonstrated repeatedly at battalion and regimental levels, proved insufficient to overcome Soviet operational depth and strategic resources. Soviet defensive doctrine, trading space for time, accepting heavy casualties to blunt German attacks, worked as designed despite appalling human costs. Model's defensive preparations, built from pessimistic realism about offensive prospects, saved his army from catastrophe, but couldn't save Germany from strategic defeat. The battle demonstrated that modern industrial warfare favored the side with greater resources, larger population, and capacity to sustain losses that would cripple less resilient nations. Courage, skill, and tactical proficiency still mattered, but they mattered less than industrial capacity, logistical sustainability, and strategic positioning. Kursk was Germany's last victory in the narrow sense that German forces executed complex military operations at high professional standards while facing overwhelming odds. It was also Germany's first absolute defeat in the broader sense that tactical victories no longer translated to strategic advantage. The battle marked the point where the Wehrmacht's transformation from offensive to defensive force was complete, where hopes of winning gave way to desperate attempts to avoid losing catastrophically, where the question shifted from "how do we win" to "how do we survive?" Model's Ninth Army survived Kursk through professional competence that would be studied by military professionals for generations. But survival within strategic defeat is itself a form of tragedy, continuing to fight excellently for a cause already lost, each preserving lives through tactical skill, only to risk those same lives in subsequent hopeless battles, maintaining professional standards while serving political leadership whose strategic incompetence made those professional standards ultimately futile. The last German victory at Kursk was a victory of soldiers over circumstances, of professional military art over impossible missions, of human courage over the reality that courage alone couldn't change outcomes. It was a victory that saved an army while losing a war, that demonstrated excellence while proving excellence insufficient, that showed what German military professionalism could achieve while revealing what it couldn't prevent. And in that paradox, tactical triumph within strategic catastrophe, lies the battle's enduring significance and tragedy. The Ninth Army fought brilliantly at Kursk. It survived Kursk through skill and preparation, and then it spent the next 22 months fighting brilliantly in continuous retreat until it was destroyed in Berlin, defending a capital of a regime that deserved none of the courage its soldiers showed. That is the legacy of Kursk, the last moment when German tactical excellence seemed to matter, before the crushing weight of strategic reality made clear that excellence, however genuine, couldn't overcome the fundamental bankruptcy of the cause it served.